In the quiet landscapes of late 19th century America, a child was born whose life would drift across continents, crises, and eras of profound change. The rural settlement of West Branch, Iowa, offered a gentle rhythm of fields, unpaved roads, and the steady traditions of Quaker families who shaped much of the local life. It was here, in 1874, that Herbert Hoover began a journey that would eventually carry him from modest beginnings to a long and complex presence on the world stage. His lifetime would span the fading years of the frontier, the rise of industrial power, 2 world wars, and the reshaping of global governance. Through those years, he would become known both for humanitarian dedication and for the weight of the challenges that met his presidency. As this story unfolds, it does so with quiet attention to the gradual passage of time and the steady evolution of a life lived across the 20th century. If you wish to support these peaceful explorations of history, you may choose to like the video, subscribe to the channel, or share the place from which you are listening. These small gestures help the series continue, while the narrative itself remains unhurried. Now, with a calm and open horizon before us, the life of Herbert Hoover begins. The story opens in the modest surroundings of West Branch, a small Quaker community in eastern Iowa, where the seasons moved with dependable regularity. Herbert Hoover entered the world on August 10th, 1874, in a simple home built of wood, surrounded by the muted colours of the Midwestern prairie. His parents, Jesse and Huldah Hoover, then lived within a tradition that valued plain conduct, steady labour, and quiet faith. Their home reflected these principles, structured around routines that offered both order and warmth. The town itself was a collection of practical dwellings, workshops, and meeting houses arranged along broad, unpaved streets. Children played near orchards and creeks, and the scent of harvested crops drifted through late summer air. In this environment, Hoover spent his earliest days under the guidance of a family known for its craftsmanship and reliability. His father worked as a blacksmith, a profession requiring precision and patient skill. The forge stood at the centre of the community's daily rhythms, its steady heat shaping tools for farms and households throughout the area. Life in a Quaker settlement emphasized moderation. Gatherings were simple, marked by periods of silence intended to bring clarity and reflection. This surrounding culture encouraged calm discipline from childhood onward, forming a quiet foundation for the sensibilities Hoover would carry throughout his life. The setting also reflected the larger character of rural America during the 1870s, an era defined by agricultural routines, limited communication with faraway places, and a sense of stability that seemed both enduring and fragile. Herbert's mother brought additional dimension to the household. She was active in the local meeting and participated in maintaining the community's ties of mutual support. Her attention to order and her engagement with those around her introduced her children to the idea that each person held responsibilities both within and beyond the family circle. The days in the Hoover home were filled with practices that were slow and deliberate, preparing meals from nearby fields, tending to household tasks, and observing the quiet pace of the settlement. West Branch was small enough that neighbours recognised each child by name, and children were often surrounded by familiar faces during their earliest experiences. The shared expectations of Quaker upbringing encouraged honest conduct and thoughtful restraint. For Herbert, these early surroundings created a gentle structure in which curiosity could form without haste. Beyond the immediate boundaries of the village, the wider region was beginning to change. Rail lines were expanding across the Midwest, bringing the early whispers of national growth. Though West Branch remained modest, the faint presence of a more connected America was already becoming visible. These developments stood in subtle contrast to the simplicity of daily routines in the town, suggesting a world that would eventually grow much larger for the young boy. Within this early setting, Herbert's experiences were primarily shaped by the steady presence of family and community. His parents emphasized industry, self-reliance, and a thoughtful approach to daily responsibilities. Even in childhood, he encountered the expectation that one should work with care, observe the needs of others, and approach challenges with quiet determination. As seasons passed across the prairies of Iowa, the foundations of Hoover's character took form in ways that would accompany him long after he left West Branch. The calm fields, the gentle cadence of Quaker gatherings, and the subtle order of family life created an early world defined by stability. This period would be brief, yet its influence would remain, shaping the earliest contours of a life that would extend far beyond the quiet roads of the town where it began. The quiet rhythms of Herbert Hoover's early years unfolded within the reassuring patterns of a small Quaker community, yet the steadiness of that world would not endure for long. In 1880, when Herbert was just 6 years old, the gentle order of his childhood changed with the sudden illness of his father. Jesse Hoover, known throughout West Branch for his patient workmanship and practical skill, suffered from a heart condition that brought his life to an early close. His passing left a noticeable stillness in the home, altering the sound of each day. The forge that had once been filled with measured activity now stood without its craftsman, and the family began navigating life without the figure who had anchored so much of their daily routine. For a time, Herbert's mother continued to guide the household with quiet resolve. Huldah Hoover approached responsibilities with a calm focus shaped by her faith and by the expectations of the community that surrounded her. She supported her children with gentle consistency, ensuring that lessons continued, chores were completed, and the rhythm of family life remained intact. The children were encouraged to observe the values of thrift, sincerity, and mutual care, principles that were essential both within the home and across the surrounding Quaker settlement. Yet the world around them was shifting once again. In 1884, when Herbert was 9 years old, his mother fell ill with pneumonia, a condition that progressive medicine had not yet learned to treat effectively. Her illness lingered through the winter months, and despite the efforts of neighbours and extended family, she passed away. The loss marked a quiet turning point in Herbert's childhood, leaving him and his siblings, Theodore and Mary, without either parent. The town, accustomed to the gradual changes of farm seasons and religious practice, recognised the weight of this moment, and members of the community stepped forward with the deliberate kindness expected in Quaker tradition. Orphanhood in late 19th century America often meant a scattering of siblings among relatives or neighbours, and the Hoover children were no exception. Herbert, known for his calm disposition and thoughtful manner, was taken in by his maternal uncle, Dr. Henry John Minthorn. Minthorn was a physician and educator whose life path would soon lead the boy far from the landscapes he had always known. Before that journey began, Herbert remained for a brief period in West Branch, living with extended family while arrangements were made for the children's futures. The separation from his brother and sister occurred gradually, each child placed in the care of family members who could provide stability. These transitions, though handled as gently as possible, represented a gradual reshaping of Herbert's world. The quiet home of his earliest memories had dissolved into a series of temporary arrangements. Even within the warm and steady culture of Quaker life, there was an inevitable sense of impermanence. The values instilled by his parents, precision in work, modesty in conduct, honesty in communication, remained with him, yet the structure through which they had been taught was changing shape. As the months passed, Herbert began adjusting to new surroundings. Extended relatives offered support, but the patterns of daily life differed from those he had known. Work was shared differently, meals followed new routines, and the spaces where he slept and studied no longer bore the familiar warmth of the home in which he'd been born. These distinctions were subtle, but they accumulated, shaping a quiet resourcefulness in the young boy. He learned to adapt without complaint, settling into the expectations of each new environment with a quiet steadiness that would later become a defining feature of his character. The community around him played a significant role during this transitional period. West Branch remained a place of modest houses, working farms and meeting houses where individuals gathered in thoughtful silence. Even as Herbert's family structure changed, the broader setting continued to offer a sense of continuity. Neighbours observed the children's movements with gentle attention, ensuring that they were not left without support. The Quaker practice of mutual care extended naturally into these circumstances, providing the children with guidance during a period that might otherwise have been marked by uncertainty. Yet the direction of Herbert's life would soon shift in a more pronounced way. His uncle Minthorn, after establishing a livelihood in the western states, extended an invitation for the boy to join him. This would mean leaving Iowa entirely, exchanging the familiar landscapes of his earliest years for the open expanses of Oregon, where new communities were forming in the final years of American westward expansion. Such a move represented more than a change in geography. It signalled the beginning of a new chapter in which Herbert would learn to navigate unfamiliar surroundings, new social expectations, and a broader sense of the world. Before departing, Herbert spent time making quiet farewells to the places connected to his early memories. The modest home where he had lived with his parents, the forge that had once been filled with the steady rhythm of his father's work, and the meeting house where his family had worshipped all held significance. These places, though simple in appearance, represented stability during his earliest years. Their calm presence remained in his memory long after he began travelling west. The separation from his siblings also shaped the tone of this period. Theodore and Mary were placed with different relatives, leading each to follow distinct paths during adolescence. Although correspondence and occasional visits provided connection, their shared childhood had already taken on a distant quality. Herbert, the middle child, carried the soft imprint of those early relationships with him, even when daily life no longer included the presence of his brother and sister. These changes did not bring abrupt emotional turmoil. Rather, they unfolded with the slow certainty of circumstances beyond a child's control. Herbert responded with the reserve characteristic of his upbringing. Instead of outward displays of distress, he adjusted quietly, yet absorbing each transition with the same deliberate calm that he had learned in his earliest years. The challenges of orphanhood introduced a sense of independence that would grow stronger as he entered adolescence. By the time preparations were complete for his relocation to Oregon, Herbert had already begun forming the inward discipline that would become a hallmark of his personal and professional life. The values instilled by his parents remained with him, not as rigid doctrines but as gentle guideposts. The transitions he experienced after their passing, in home, family structure, and community, served as formative experiences that quietly shaped his understanding of responsibility and perseverance. The journey west would soon begin, carrying him away from the familiar fields of Iowa into a developing region marked by new opportunities and new responsibilities. As this chapter of his life closed, the boy who had once lived within the steady pace of a small Quaker town prepared to enter a broader world, guided by early lessons that would remain with him throughout the decades ahead. The transition from the quiet fields of Iowa to the distant landscapes of the American West marked a gentle yet significant turning in Herbert Hoover's early life. When his maternal uncle, Dr. Henry John Minthorn, extended the invitation to join his household in Oregon, the decision carried both practicality and possibility. For a young boy whose recent years had been shaped by the stillness that followed loss, the westward journey represented the slow unfolding of a new chapter. It aligned with a period in American history when families, educators, and entrepreneurs were moving across the continent in search of wider horizons and more settled futures. The preparations for travel were simple. Herbert gathered his few belongings, most of them modest items that reflected the careful habits of Quaker upbringing. Relatives and neighbours in West Branch offered quiet farewells, placing gentle hands on his shoulder, offering blessings that emphasized steadiness and good conduct. The town that had shaped his earliest memories, its unpaved streets, its meeting house, its familiar seasonal patterns, remained unchanged as he stepped away from it. Yet for Herbert, the landscape had already begun to separate into the compartments of memory. The prairie fields, once part of his daily experience, they would soon become recollections carried forward rather than spaces he inhabited. Travel across the country in the 1880s was a gradual experience. Railroads connected regions with increasing efficiency, yet the pace remained measured. For Herbert, the journey likely consisted of long hours spent in observation rather than conversation. The passing scenery changed from farmland to plains, from river valleys to stretches of open terrain that seemed unaffected by towns or roads. Such movement offered time for reflection, allowing the boy to absorb the quiet permanence of distance. The sound of train wheels steadying over rails formed a rhythmic backdrop, a kind of unspoken reassurance that each mile carried him closer to a new home. Oregon in this period was still part of the expanding western frontier, shaped by logging, agriculture, and the arrival of settlers who sought opportunity in the region's fertile land. Dr. Minthorn and his wife were involved in education and community development, and their lives reflected the earnest hopes of families who believed in the possibilities of the West. Herbert's arrival added a new dimension to their household, which already functioned as a space where discipline, learning, and religious practice were integrated into everyday routines. The town of Newburgh, where the Minthorn family eventually settled, was a small but growing community. It maintained the values of its Quaker residents while slowly taking on the characteristics of a developing settlement. Wooden houses bordered by modest gardens lined the streets, and the presence of orchards signalled the agricultural promise of the region, and the landscape differed markedly from the broad prairies of Iowa. Oregon's rolling hills, evergreen forests, and mist-filled mornings created a quieter, more contemplative backdrop. Herbert adjusted to these surroundings gradually, absorbing details of climate and terrain with the same attentiveness that had defined his childhood. Daily life in the Minthorn household emphasized routine. Dr. Minthorn's commitment to education shaped the environment, providing Herbert with opportunities to pursue academic study. The quiet expectations set by his uncle aligned well with the boy's temperament. Tasks were completed with care, lessons approached with seriousness, and the household maintained the reflective quality that was familiar from Herbert's earlier upbringing. While the structure differed from the home he'd known in Iowa, it carried enough continuity to ease the transition. The local Quaker meeting played a central role in shaping the rhythms of life in Newburgh. Gatherings were marked by silence, allowing members to reflect inwardly before speaking. Herbert attended these meetings regularly, bringing with him the early teachings of his parents and the values reinforced by the community that had first raised him. The tones and patterns of this environment reinforced qualities that were already evident in him: reserve, attentiveness, and a thoughtful approach to responsibility. Outside the meeting house, the developing town offered glimpses of broader changes underway across the American West. New roads were being laid, mills were operating near rivers, and educational institutions were slowly taking shape. So the region was beginning to establish its identity within the greater expanse of the country, yet it retained the calm of a place not yet crowded by rapid growth. For Herbert, these surroundings provided a blend of stability and novelty, familiar enough to offer comfort, yet expansive enough to suggest future possibilities. His relationship with his uncle deepened over time. Dr. Minthorn recognized in Herbert a quiet determination that could be shaped through discipline and experience. Under his uncle's guidance, the boy learned to balance academic work with practical responsibilities. Tasks involving the household or community projects were undertaken with care, reinforcing the values of diligence and modesty. The environment also introduced Herbert to new forms of self-reliance. Life in a developing town required adaptability, and he gradually gained skills that would later influence his professional and organizational strengths. The journey to Oregon also marked the beginning of Herbert's growing independence. Though still young, he learned to navigate responsibilities without the close presence of parents or siblings. Letters to family members provided occasional connection, yet distance made physical reunions rare. This separation strengthened a quiet inward resilience, allowing him to approach new roles with steadiness rather than hesitation. The capacity to observe, evaluate, and persist, qualities that would later characterize his work as an engineer and humanitarian, first emerged in these early years of adjustment. As seasons passed in Oregon, the landscapes around Newburgh changed with characteristic gentleness. Winter rains nourished the soil, spring introduced new growth, and the orchards surrounding the town produced fruits that sustained local households. The steadiness of these cycles offered Herbert a sense of grounding after the abrupt transitions of earlier years. He spent time learning about the land, participating in the work that defined life in the region, and becoming gradually accustomed to the quiet industry that shaped the community. This period also introduced him to the idea of education as a pathway toward practical achievement. Schools in the region, though modest, emphasized subjects that were increasingly important in a changing nation. Mathematics, science, and basic engineering concepts were taught alongside literature and history. Herbert approached these lessons with seriousness, recognizing in them the possibility of meaningful work someday. The encouragement he received from his uncle and from teachers strengthened his confidence, guiding him gently toward a future that would be closely tied to technical study. By the late 1880s, Herbert's life in Oregon had taken on a pattern that was both stable and purposeful. The memory of Iowa remained with him, yet it no longer defined his daily experience. He was becoming a young man shaped by the landscapes of the West, by the patience of educators, and by the quiet expectations of a community that valued integrity and perseverance. These influences merged gradually, preparing him for decisions that would carry him further still from his earlier surroundings. This chapter in his life, defined by relocation and adaptation, marked the slow shaping of identity in a new environment. As he continued to grow within the steady rhythms of Oregon life, the foundations were quietly forming for the next stage of his journey, one that would lead him toward higher education and the broader horizons that awaited beyond the Pacific Northwest. By the early 1890s, Herbert Hoover had grown into a quiet and deliberate young man whose early experiences had cultivated a steady inner discipline. Life in Oregon had provided stability after a childhood shaped by loss. Yet another transition now beckoned, a movement toward higher education that would open the way to a broader world. The founding of a new university in California, still taking shape on the expansive lands near Palo Alto, offered an opportunity that aligned with his interests and the practical hopes held for him by his uncle, Dr. Henry John Minthorn. This institution, the Stanford University, was preparing to admit its first class in 1891, and Herbert was among those who sought entrance. In the late summer of that year, he began the journey southward. The distance between Oregon and California reflected not only geography, but also a shift in the scale of his surroundings. After years spent in small towns shaped by Quaker simplicity, the anticipation of joining a large academic community carried with it a quiet sense of expansion. the train south travelled through forests, valleys, and agricultural plains, offering long hours of contemplation. Herbert, as was typical for him, observed rather than spoke, absorbing the subtle transitions in landscape with a calm attentiveness that matched his temperament. Upon arriving at the young campus, he encountered a setting unlike any he had known. The buildings, constructed in a warm sandstone hue, were arranged around broad arcades that opened onto expansive courtyards. The design reflected both ambition and a desire for harmony with the surrounding terrain. Palm trees lined the avenues leading toward the central quadrangle, creating a peaceful atmosphere despite the institution's newness. Students and faculty, gathering from different states and backgrounds, moved about with a mixture of curiosity and purpose as they prepared for the inaugural term. Herbert approached these surroundings with characteristic reserve. He enrolled in the program of mining engineering, a field that combined practical application with scientific study. The discipline suited his inclination toward careful problem-solving and methodical work. Classes introduced him to geology, mineralogy, mechanical structures, and surveying, subjects that required both precision and patience. The instruction he received came at a time when engineering professions were becoming integral to the nation's industrial development, and Herbert's interest grew steadily as he recognized the usefulness of the skills he was acquiring. Life on campus followed a rhythm shaped by the structure of study and the energy of a new institution finding its identity. Students attended lectures in classrooms that still carried the faint smell of fresh plaster, and long tables in the libraries offered space for extended periods of quiet reading. The surrounding land, still open and lightly developed, provided room for walks during the later afternoon hours when the sun cast long shadows across the foothills. Herbert often spent time outdoors after completing his assignments, there observing the natural formations that reflected the geological concepts he learned in class. He also took on work to support himself financially. During his early months at the university, he found employment doing campus chores and assisting with various tasks necessary to maintain the new grounds. Later, he worked as a part-time assistant in the geology department, preparing samples and organizing materials for instruction. These responsibilities reinforced the habits of diligence and independence he had learned during his youth, and they allowed him to navigate academic life without relying solely on the resources of his extended family. The atmosphere at the university encouraged cooperation more than competition. Faculty members, aware that they were establishing a new educational tradition, and he cultivated an environment in which students could pursue intellectual curiosity without undue pressure. This suited Herbert well. He approached his studies with steady commitment, forming a quiet reputation as a dependable and conscientious student. The friendships he developed during these years were shaped by mutual respect rather than social display, and many of these relationships endured long after his time at the university had concluded. Campus life also exposed him to a wider range of perspectives than he had previously encountered. Students arrived from cities, farming regions, and small towns across the United States, each bringing different experiences to classroom discussions and informal gatherings. Herbert listened more often than he spoke, yet he absorbed the variety of viewpoints around him, and this exposure broadened his understanding of the world beyond the boundaries of the communities in which he had lived. While he maintained the modesty and restraint of his upbringing, he gradually grew more comfortable navigating conversations that touched on national developments, technological progress, and the shifting social landscapes of the late 19th century. Academic fieldwork formed an important part of his education. Trips into nearby mountains and valleys allowed students to observe geological formations firsthand. Herbert approached these excursions with quiet enthusiasm, carrying notebooks and tools with the same care he applied to his campus studies. The combination of outdoor exploration and technical instruction deepened his interest in the practical applications of engineering. He learned to identify mineral deposits, measure land elevation, and assess structural features that would later prove essential in his professional undertakings. As his years at Stanford progressed, Herbert's sense of purpose became more defined. He recognized that his chosen field held opportunities for meaningful work in regions far beyond the familiar landscapes of the American West. Mining engineering offered a practical path into a world increasingly shaped by industrial activity and global exchange. Though he remained grounded in the quiet values of his upbringing, he was beginning to envision a career that extended far beyond the university grounds. The broader environment of California also left an impression on him. The mild climate, the varied terrain of coastal plains and inland hills, and the emerging industries of the region provided context for his studies. Even as he devoted long hours to academic work, he remained attentive to the gradual development of the communities surrounding the university. The state was entering a period of economic growth, and its expanding infrastructure offered examples of engineering in practice, bridges, irrigation systems, and mines that illustrated the applications of the concepts he encountered in class. Herbert completed his program of study in 1895. His years at the university had shaped his character in subtle yet lasting ways. The combination of academic discipline, practical work, and exposure to a broader social environment had strengthened his sense of independence and direction. While he remained reserved and modest in demeanor, he carried with him a growing confidence in his ability to contribute meaningfully to the world beyond California. As he prepared to leave the campus, the sandstone buildings and open courtyards stood as markers of a formative period. The quiet boy who had once travelled from Iowa to Oregon had now matured into a young engineer ready to enter a wider professional landscape. His studies had provided him with practical tools, and the environment of Stanford University had offered space for steady personal growth. With his degree complete, Herbert stepped toward the next chapter of his life, one that would lead him into the early stages of a global career shaped by both opportunity and responsibility. With his studies complete and his degree newly earned, Herbert Hoover stepped slowly into the professional world of mining engineering, a field that combined scientific understanding with the practical realities of industry. The decade of the 1890s was a period of global expansion in mineral exploration, shaped by new technologies, fresh discoveries, and the increasing interconnectedness of international markets. For a young engineer seeking experience, possibilities extended far beyond the borders of the United States. Hoover, guided by a combination of technical preparation and quiet determination, began his professional journey in this evolving landscape. His first position came through the assistance of a former professor who recognized Hoover's diligence and suitability for fieldwork. The opportunity lay in the mining regions of the Sierra Nevada, where gold and other minerals continued to draw engineers, laborers, and investors. The environment of these early assignments contrasted sharply with the structured calm of his university years. Mining camps operated with a rhythm dictated by geology, weather, and the demands of extraction. Equipment was hauled over rough terrain, shafts were dug with careful calculations, and the daily work required an engineer to balance safety with productivity. Hoover entered this atmosphere with characteristic steadiness. His responsibilities included surveying land, assessing ore quality, and assisting senior engineers in planning excavation systems. Much of the work took place outdoors, where he moved across uneven ground with notebooks and instruments, recording observations that would inform decisions about the viability of each site. The fieldwork demanded physical endurance, yet it also reinforced the habits of careful observation he had begun cultivating in earlier years. He approached each task methodically, mindful of the importance of accuracy in an industry where miscalculations could lead to financial loss or operational setbacks. Though still early in his career, Hoover's reliability soon became apparent. He completed assignments without hesitation, accepted challenging tasks without complaint, and maintained a quiet focus that earned the respect of colleagues. The mining operations he encountered varied widely in scale and success. Some sites were nearing the end of their productive lives, while others showed potential for expansion. His role was not to manage these enterprises but to study them carefully, providing recommendations based on geological evidence and engineering principles. After gaining early experience in the American West, Hoover accepted an opportunity that would carry him beyond the United States. His employers recognized his competence and offered him a position with an international mining firm seeking engineers for operations in Australia. This transition from domestic work to global assignments signaled the beginning of a career that would unfold across continents. International travel in the late 19th century required patience, yet Hoover approached the journey with the same quiet endurance that had guided earlier transitions. The long voyage by ship offered time for reading technical materials and contemplating the professional responsibilities that awaited him. Upon arriving in Western Australia, Hoover found himself in a region undergoing rapid development, where goldfields stretched across arid landscapes, drawing miners and engineers from around the world. Each site presented its own challenges related to climate, geology, and accessibility. Hoover's work involved not only technical assessments, but also coordination with diverse groups of workers, many of whom came from different cultural backgrounds and spoke different languages. He navigated these settings with the reserve and attentiveness that had always characterized him, communicating clearly when necessary and observing quietly when conversation was not required. His role expanded gradually. He was asked to evaluate mines that were in various stages of development, some newly established and others struggling to maintain profitability. His reports were thorough and grounded in careful measurement, were traits that set his work apart at a time when mining ventures often suffered from overly optimistic assumptions. His ability to remain objective, supported by precise calculations and methodical analysis, made his assessments valuable to companies seeking reliable guidance. Hoover's time in Australia also introduced him to the logistical complexities of mining operations in remote areas. Equipment had to be transported over long distances, water sources were limited in certain regions, and the heat demanded careful planning to ensure the safety of those working underground. He learned to account for these factors while preparing recommendations, recognizing that engineering solutions needed to address both technical and environmental considerations. These experiences strengthened his competence and broadened his understanding of the field in ways that classroom instruction could not replicate. Following his success in Australia, Hoover was sent to locations in Asia, marking another step in the widening scope of his professional life. His assignments in China involved evaluating mines in regions shaped by distinctive geological formations and long-standing local industries. Here, he worked alongside both foreign engineers and local labourers, gaining insight into the ways mining practices adapted to varied cultural and environmental contexts. Though communication could be challenging, Hoover relied on clarity of instruction and attentiveness to detail, maintaining steady progress in environments that were occasionally unpredictable. Throughout these early years, Hoover developed a reputation for efficiency and integrity. He did not seek promotion actively, yet opportunities arose naturally as organizations recognized the quality of his work. His reports were valued for their clarity, and his decisions were respected for their grounding in careful study rather than speculation. His growing expertise allowed him to advise companies on whether to expand operations, adjust processes, or close mines that were no longer viable. These responsibilities required a balance between technical judgment and practical restraint, qualities that suited Hoover's temperament The international nature of his assignments also exposed him to the broader economic networks that connected mining regions across the world. He observed how mineral resources contributed to industrial development, how fluctuations in global markets influenced local operations, and how engineering advancements could alter the prospects of entire regions. Though his focus remained on the practical demands of each project, these patterns quietly informed his understanding of the relationship between natural resources and economic growth. As the decade progressed, Hoover's early experiences formed the foundation for his future career. He had worked in challenging terrain, assessed complex geological formations, and adapted to environments that required patience and adaptability. He had learned to manage responsibilities with quiet confidence, relying on the habits of discipline and precision that had shaped him since childhood. These years did not yet hint at the humanitarian work or public responsibilities that would later define his life, yet they were essential in developing the skills and perspective that he would bring to every subsequent role. The young engineer who had left Stanford only a few years earlier had now established himself in a profession that demanded both technical knowledge and personal steadiness. His early steps in mining engineering revealed a capacity for careful judgment, respectful engagement with colleagues, and persistence in the face of practical challenges. These qualities would guide him as he continued to move through the expanding world of international industry, preparing him gently for the broader responsibilities that awaited beyond the mines and mineral fields of his early career. As Herbert Hoover's early assignments carried him from one continent to another, his professional world widened in steady, deliberate stages. By the mid-1890s, he had become part of a global network of engineers, financiers, and geologists who worked across great distances to identify and develop mineral deposits. His reputation for accuracy and practical judgment continued to grow, and companies began seeking him for increasingly complex evaluations. The nature of his work meant frequent travel, and each assignment introduced him to environments shaped by distinct histories, climates, and working conditions. Through these experiences, he cultivated a quiet adaptability that allowed him to move through unfamiliar regions without losing the reserved steadiness that had defined him since childhood. His responsibilities expanded to include oversight of mines whose potential required careful study. He travelled to regions in Africa where vast stretches of terrain remained underexplored by modern geological standards. There, he encountered mining communities arranged around clusters of equipment and temporary dwellings, shaped by the rhythms of labour and the uncertainties of extraction. Hoover studied the land with attentive patience, noting the composition of rock layers, the distribution of minerals, and the logistical demands of each site. His reports reflected not only technical competence, but also an understanding of the environmental realities that influenced mining operations in hot, dry climates. In other parts of the world, he encountered challenges of a different nature. Mountain regions required precise calculations to account for elevation, weather patterns, and access routes that shifted with the seasons. Tropical climates introduced issues of humidity and vegetation that affected both equipment and labour conditions. Throughout these varied settings, Hoover maintained a consistent approach. He observed, measured, recorded, and evaluated, allowing the evidence before him to guide his recommendations. His quiet manner and absence of unnecessary commentary made him a dependable figure among colleagues who valued clarity over discussion. The organizations that employed him appreciated this steadiness. As he completed each assignment, new opportunities emerged, many involving greater responsibility. He was sent to evaluate properties not only for mining potential, but also for financial feasibility. These tasks required him to balance geological observations with the economic factors that shaped investment decisions. He learned to assess the cost of equipment transport, the viability of infrastructure, and the projected yield of mineral deposits. His reports were written with precision, offering investors a reliable foundation for their decisions. Hoover's grounding in practical engineering also helped him navigate the interpersonal dimensions of international work. He interacted with workers from diverse cultural backgrounds, each bringing their own methods and expectations to the mining environment. Though reserved in speech, he showed respect for those he worked alongside, recognizing the importance of collaboration in a field that depended on both technical planning and physical labor. This respect earned him the trust of teams who appreciated the calm clarity of his leadership, even in situations that required complex coordination. Yet the demands of travel and work did not leave much room for extended periods of rest. Hoover often stayed only as long as necessary to complete an evaluation or oversee a crucial stage of planning. Once the work was finished, he moved on to the next assignment, carrying with him notebooks filled with observations and measurements. His life during these years took on a rhythm shaped by ship departures, railway connections, and the steady accumulation of professional experience. Yet despite the movement, he maintained a quiet centre of focus that kept him grounded. These experiences also provided insight into the broader social and economic landscapes of the regions he visited. He observed how mining operations influenced local economies, bringing waves of workers to remote areas and creating temporary settlements that shifted with the success or decline of each venture. He saw how environmental conditions shaped the possibilities and limits of industrial development. Though his role remained technical rather than political, these observations contributed to an expanding understanding of the world's interconnectedness, a perspective that would later play a role in his humanitarian and public service work. By his late 20s, Hoover's reputation had grown to the point that he was sometimes asked not merely to evaluate mines, but to manage operations that required structural reorganization. These responsibilities included directing improvements in equipment use, adjusting extraction methods, and helping companies refine long-term strategies. He carried out these tasks with the same quiet diligence that characterized his earlier work, approaching each decision through methodical study rather than speculation. The pace of his international work reflected the era's expanding global industries. Communication across continents depended on telegraphs and letters, yet despite these limitations, companies operated with a sense of urgency. Engineers like Hoover occupied a role that lay between the technical and the administrative, bridging the gap between scientific observation and practical decision-making. Hoover excelled in this position. His ability to maintain focus amid shifting environments made him well suited for tasks that required clarity in the midst of uncertainty. During this period, Hoover also began forming connections with other professionals who shared his interests in geology and engineering. These relationships, though often marked by the distances involved, created a network of colleagues who recognized one another's skills and collaborated across borders. Such networks were essential in an age when mining enterprises relied on expertise drawn from multiple countries. Hoover's name began appearing more frequently in correspondence and reports, quietly establishing him as a respected figure in the international mining community. Despite the weight of responsibilities and the constant travel, Hoover remained consistent in his personal habits. He maintained careful records, preserved a disciplined routine, and approached each new challenge without display or impatience. His life did not revolve around comforts or leisure, but around the work before him and the steady fulfillment of professional obligations. These years formed a period of growth not only in technical skill, but also in the quiet assurance that he could navigate complex environments with reliability. By the close of the decade, Herbert Hoover had transformed from a young engineer beginning his first field assignments into a seasoned professional whose work had taken him across continents. His experiences in diverse climates and cultures had broadened his understanding of both the natural world and the human systems that interacted with it. the steady accumulation of knowledge, shaped by travel and practical responsibility, prepared him for yet another transition, one that would soon involve navigating difficult circumstances in a region experiencing political unrest. These widening horizons mark the threshold of a new period in his professional life, one in which the challenges he encountered would require not only technical judgment, but also measured composure in the face of events beyond engineering alone. As Herbert Hoover entered the final years of the 19th century, his professional work brought him to northern China, where he served as a mining engineer and consultant for companies seeking to develop operations in a region marked by striking geological potential and a long cultural history. This assignment, like many before it, began as a technical endeavour. Yet circumstances in China were changing, reshaped by international pressures and internal unrest that were gradually intensifying. Hoover, accustomed to moving quietly through unfamiliar regions, soon found himself in an environment where the rhythms of ordinary work intersected with the growing tensions that would lead to the Boxer Uprising. At the time of his arrival, foreign engineers, traders and diplomats were present in several Chinese provinces, participating in various commercial and industrial projects. Mining operations depended on the cooperation of local officials and workers, and Hoover approached these partnerships with the same respectful attentiveness that had guided his interactions in other countries. He inspected equipment, supervised geological assessments, and prepared reports outlining the conditions necessary for successful extraction. The work was steady, and despite the cultural and linguistic differences around him, he maintained a calm and focused routine. The atmosphere of the region, however, was beginning to shift. Discontent among local groups had been growing for years, fueled by concerns about foreign influence, natural disasters, and disruptions to traditional structures. The movement that came to be known as the Boxer Uprising drew support from individuals who believed that foreign presence threatened the stability of their communities. For those living and working in areas touched by this sentiment, the change in the air was noticeable, though the pace of daily work often continued without immediate interruption. Hoover and his wife, Lou Henry Hoover, who had joined him in China after their marriage, experienced these early signs quietly. Lou, trained in geology and equally comfortable in remote working environments, participated in aspects of his professional life, offering companionship and support during assignments that required extended stays far from urban centres. Together, they observed the growing tension with measured awareness, adapting their routines as necessary, while maintaining focus on the responsibilities before them. As unrest increased, foreign residents in various regions began receiving advisories encouraging caution. These notices reflected the complexity of the situation rather than immediate danger. Mining operations continued, yet the presence of soldiers and patrols became more visible. Hoover, accustomed to environments where conditions shifted gradually due to geological or logistical constraints, now observed changes driven by human circumstances, or still, he maintained the deliberate composure that had guided him through challenges in other parts of the world. By 1900, the uprising had intensified across northern China. Foreign nationals and Chinese Christians in some areas faced threats as tensions escalated. In cities with diplomatic presence, international contingents began coordinating defensive measures, while civilians prepared for possible disruptions to transportation and communication. Hoover and Lou found themselves within this unfolding situation, yet their movements during this time reflected the same calm pragmatism that guided the rest of Herbert's early career. Their immediate priority, like that of many foreign workers in the region, became ensuring safe passage when possible. They assisted others in securing transportation and contributed quietly to logistical efforts that supported evacuations. Herbert's engineering background allowed him to provide practical guidance on matters involving travel routes, available resources, and structural safety. These contributions were not dramatic in nature. Instead, they reflected a steady application of technical knowledge to circumstances in which clarity and calm decision-making were essential. Throughout these developments, Hoover did not abandon the underlying tasks associated with his professional commitments. Even as operations were disrupted, he continued documenting conditions, preparing assessments, and gathering information that would be needed once the region stabilized. His reports from this period reflected a balanced tone, as acknowledging both the progress and the interruptions that shaped the work. This ability to maintain focus amid shifting external conditions illustrated the same disciplined temperament that had been visible since his earliest assignments. After movement became possible again, Hoover and Liu travelled away from the areas most affected by the uprising. The departure was careful and orderly, shaped by cooperation among foreign residents, local guides, and officials who recognized the value of maintaining stability where possible. Once they reached safety, Hoover provided assistance to companies seeking to determine the status of their properties and the next steps required for recovery. His understanding of the region's geology and infrastructure allowed him to offer practical recommendations grounded in first-hand observation. And the experience in China deepened Hoover's appreciation for the ways in which global events could affect technical and industrial projects. He had witnessed how political unrest shaped the ability of communities to collaborate, how transportation systems became vulnerable, and how industrial plans could be disrupted by circumstances unrelated to the natural conditions of the land. These insights would later contribute to his broader understanding of international affairs, informing the analytical perspective he carried into humanitarian and governmental roles. While the Boxer uprising represented a period of instability, it also revealed aspects of Hoover's character that had been forming quietly for years. His response emphasized steadiness rather than reaction, observation rather than assumption, and practical action rather than display. He approached each situation by considering the needs of those around him and applying his skills where they were most useful. These qualities, visible in small details during the events in China, would reappear throughout his later life, particularly in moments requiring organization, logistical oversight, and calm judgment. When the region gradually returned to order after the uprising, Hoover continued to contribute to efforts aimed at restoring operations and assisting companies in re-establishing their work. His assignments in China eventually came to a close as new opportunities arose in other parts of the world. Yet the memory of this period, its challenges, disruptions, and the quiet resourcefulness it required, remained with him. It marked a stage in his career where engineering skill intersected with global developments, illustrating how technical expertise could serve practical needs even in uncertain circumstances. By the time he left China, Hoover had expanded not only his professional experience, but also his understanding of the interplay between industry and global affairs. The years that followed would draw him further into international work, opening new paths in his developing career. The calm endurance he had shown during the uprising would become one of his defining traits, carried with him into the wider roles that awaited in the early decades of the 20th century. As the 20th century began, Herbert Hoover entered a period of professional stability and growing recognition. His work across continents had established him as an engineer capable of navigating complex geological, logistical, and administrative challenges. Companies in Europe, Asia, Africa, and Australia increasingly sought his expertise, trusting his ability to provide clear evaluations grounded in careful study. Though still young, he had accumulated a breadth of international experience rare among engineers of his generation, and this experience formed the basis of a career that now expanded into leadership roles within major mining and metallurgical enterprises. During these years, Hoover transitioned from field assignments to more senior responsibilities. He became involved in reorganizing struggling mining ventures, improving operational methods, and advising financial groups on the viability of projects under consideration. His work was guided by a measured understanding of both engineering principles and economic realities. In reports submitted to company boards, he presented findings with quiet clarity, offering conclusions drawn from evidence rather than optimism. Investors who had previously relied on speculative assessments now valued his restrained, factual approach, which provided a dependable foundation for decision-making. In London, where he eventually established a residence for professional purposes, Hoover began coordinating projects across multiple continents. Communication with distant sites required patience, structured correspondence, and a systematic way of organizing information. His office functioned as a hub where geological data, operational reports, and financial considerations were gathered and reviewed. Hoover handled these responsibilities with the same calm discipline that had shaped his early work, maintaining order amid the steady flow of inquiries and assignments. The companies that engaged him appreciated not only his technical insight, but also his ability to evaluate broader conditions that influenced mining enterprises. He understood that the success of a project depended on accessible transportation routes, reliable water sources, stable labor structures, and realistic assessments of ore quantity and quality. By presenting these factors in clear, concise terms, he helped organizations avoid investments that lacked feasibility. His reputation for honesty became as significant as his technical ability, reinforcing the trust placed in his judgment. Hoover's responsibilities continued to grow. He became a partner in a major international mining consulting firm, which positioned him at the center of professional networks extending across Europe and beyond. From this vantage point, he supervised teams of engineers, reviewed extensive documentation, and traveled periodically to sites requiring first-hand evaluation. His leadership style was marked by quiet efficiency. He preferred written analysis to extended meetings, and he encouraged colleagues to maintain the same standard of accuracy and restraint that defined his own work. During this period, Hoover also developed expertise in metallurgy, complementing his geological and engineering knowledge. Understanding the processes by which minerals were separated, refined, and prepared for industrial use allowed him to evaluate mining operations more comprehensively. He reviewed the condition of smelters, considered the efficiency of extraction methods, and recommended improvements where necessary. These assessments further established him as a figure capable of guiding companies toward long-term stability. The professional world in which Hoover now operated was shaped by global forces, economic cycles, technological developments, and shifting political conditions. Mining enterprises depended on the steady demand for metals essential to construction, transportation, and manufacturing. Hoover observed these patterns attentively, noting how fluctuations in commodity prices influenced the viability of particular ventures. He did not engage in speculation. Instead, he provided measured guidance that helped companies adapt to changing conditions without undue risk. His growing reputation also brought invitations to join corporate boards and advisory committees. These roles required a balance of technical insight and administrative discretion. Hoover contributed quietly, avoiding unnecessary prominence while ensuring that decisions rested on sound evidence. His colleagues valued the reliability of his counsel, noting that he approached each matter with the same calm deliberation that had guided his work since his earliest assignments. Despite the increasing demands of his profession, Hoover maintained a structured personal routine. He continued to study geological literature, remaining informed about new findings in mineral science and mining technology. He reviewed case studies, examined reports from engineers working in remote regions, and reflected on the long-term implications of different extraction methods. This continuous engagement with his field reinforced his standing as an authority, whose expertise rested not only on experience, but also on ongoing learning. Lou Henry Hoover supported and participated in aspects of this intellectual life. Her own background in geology allowed her to understand the technical dimensions of Herbert's work, and together they translated scientific documents and discussed developments in the field. Their shared interests created a calm, reflective environment that balanced the demands of international business. By the first decade of the new century, Hoover's professional success had reached a level that provided financial security and broadened opportunities for further influence. He was no longer simply an engineer working in the field. He had become a respected consultant, manager, an advisor whose expertise shaped the direction of major mining enterprises across the world. His steady rise did not alter his demeanour. He remained modest in speech, precise in judgment, and consistent in maintaining the disciplined habits formed during childhood and early professional years. These developments represented a turning point in his life. The years of travel and hands-on engineering had prepared him for roles that required broader oversight. His work increasingly intersected with the concerns of governments, international organizations, and financial institutions. Though still firmly within the sphere of private industry, he was becoming accustomed to responsibilities that connected technical work with global frameworks. In time, this intersection would draw him into fields far removed from mining, areas involving public welfare, international relief, and eventually national leadership. Yet at this stage, his focus remained on the professional world he had steadily built. His reputation continued to grow, shaped not by public display, but by the quiet confidence inspired by his accuracy, steadiness, and commitment to practical solutions. The foundations laid during these years would support him through the significant transitions that awaited, as his path gradually turned toward wider responsibilities beyond the mining profession. When the First World War began in 1914, Herbert Hoover was living in London, fully established in his professional career. His work as an engineer and consultant had taken him across continents, and he was recognized in international circles for his calm judgment and dependable expertise. Yet the outbreak of war brought circumstances far removed from geological surveys and industrial evaluations. The conflict disrupted transportation networks, halted shipping routes, and left thousands of American citizens stranded in Europe without access to funds or safe passage home. In this moment of uncertainty, Hoover stepped quietly into a role that would reshape the course of his life, drawing upon the organizational abilities he had refined during his years in the mining world. When the US Embassy requested assistance for the stranded Americans, Hoover's response was immediate and practical. He organized a central committee to help coordinate temporary housing, meals, travel planning, and financial support. Hotels had filled rapidly with travelers unable to leave the continent, and banks were struggling to facilitate currency exchanges amid the early days of war. Hoover and the committee brought order to this confusion by establishing clear systems for registration, financial aid, and transportation routes. What began as an emergency measure grew into a structured effort that eventually helped more than 100,000 Americans return safely to the United States. Hoover's calm approach, steady communication, and methodical problem-solving earned widespread appreciation, revealing a capacity for administrative leadership that extended far beyond technical engineering. This early relief work soon connected him to a far more demanding humanitarian responsibility. Belgium, having been overrun during the early stages of the war, faced a dire shortage of food. The occupation disrupted normal supply routes, and millions of civilians were left without access to basic provisions. International efforts were needed to ensure that these populations did not face famine. In response to the unfolding crisis, Hoover was asked to organise and direct the Commission for Relief in Belgium, an unprecedented undertaking that required both logistical precision and diplomatic patience. The Commission's work was complex. Food had to be purchased in global markets, shipped across the ocean, transported through war zones, and distributed under conditions approved by military authorities on both sides of the conflict. Neutral nations supported the effort, but regulations were strict. Each shipment required assurances that supplies would reach civilians and not be used by military forces. Hoover's disciplined organizational style proved essential in navigating these requirements. He established detailed tracking systems, devised distribution procedures, and communicated consistently with representatives of multiple governments. The work demanded long hours and steady attention. Relief ships travelled continuously, carrying wheat, rice, beans, and other essential goods. Warehouses in Belgian towns and cities were organised so that local committees could distribute rations without disruption. Children, particularly vulnerable during shortages, received special consideration in the planning. Although conditions remained difficult throughout the war, the Commission succeeded in preventing widespread famine, supporting millions of people year after year through careful coordination and sustained international cooperation. Hoover approached these tasks with the same measured tone that had guided him in earlier professional work. He relied on clear documentation, steady oversight, and the patient building of relationships. He did not seek public recognition. Instead, he focused on maintaining the systems required to keep supplies moving steadily. His leadership within the Commission earned respect across national boundaries, and he became known as a figure capable of bringing order and stability to humanitarian challenges that might otherwise have seemed insurmountable. The experience deepened Hoover's understanding of global interdependence. He observed the ways in which transportation networks, trade relations, and diplomatic agreements affected the daily well-being of civilian populations. He also saw how international cooperation, carefully organised and free from political rivalry, could support large-scale humanitarian relief. These insights gradually influenced his broader worldview, preparing him for future roles that required not only technical or organisational abilities, but also a keen awareness of global conditions. As the war continued, Hoover was repeatedly called upon to expand his relief efforts. He coordinated provisions for additional regions facing shortages and advised governments on methods of conserving food supplies. His growing involvement led naturally to the next stage of his humanitarian service, which would take place not in Europe but in the United States. When American officials recognized the need for national food organization during the conflict, Hoover was asked to lead those efforts as well. But in these early years of the First World War, his work remained primarily international. The tasks undertaken by the Commission for Relief in Belgium demonstrated that careful planning, respectful negotiation, and methodical record-keeping could sustain civilian life even amid widespread disruption. Hoover's calm presence helped stabilize operations that depended on trust and cooperation among nations at war. By the time the United States entered the conflict in 1917, Hoover had become known worldwide for his humanitarian leadership. His work in Belgium showed that a single organizer, supported by committed colleagues and neutral governments, could help protect millions from hunger. This achievement did not alter his modest demeanour, yet it marked a quiet transformation. The engineer who had once evaluated mines across continents was now emerging as a humanitarian administrator whose skills extended far beyond the boundaries of his original profession. When the United States entered the First World War in 1917, the federal government faced the challenge of organizing the nation's vast agricultural resources to support both the American population and the Allied forces overseas. The scale of the undertaking required a steady administrator capable of coordinating supply, transportation, and public cooperation without generating alarm or disorder. Herbert Hoover, whose work in Belgium had demonstrated his ability to manage complex systems under pressure, was asked to lead the newly created US Food Administration. Though his background lay in engineering rather than politics, he accepted the responsibility with the quiet determination that had guided his work throughout the previous decades. The Food Administration operated on principles that aligned well with Hoover's temperament: organization, efficiency, and voluntary cooperation. Rather than imposing compulsory rationing, the program encouraged households, restaurants, and industries to adjust their consumption habits in ways that conserved essential goods. Americans were asked to observe meatless days, wheatless days, and other practices designed to reduce pressure on supplies needed for military operations abroad. Hoover approached these initiatives with a calm emphasis on shared responsibility, believing that clear information and steady guidance would lead to public support. To carry out this work, he established a system of local committees across the country. These groups helped coordinate communication, distribute instructional materials, and reinforce the quiet unity needed to sustain conservation efforts. Hoover emphasized accuracy in data collection and clarity in reporting, ensuring that decisions were grounded in reliable information. Grain stocks, shipping timetables, livestock production, and milling capacity were all measured and tracked with the same precision he had applied to mining operations in earlier years. This methodical approach enabled the administration to anticipate shortages, adjust purchasing plans, and maintain consistent supplies for both domestic and overseas needs. The scope of the undertaking was vast. The United States had become one of the primary suppliers of food to the Allied nations, and the movement of these supplies across the Atlantic required coordination with shipping authorities and military planners. Submarine warfare made transport uncertain, and each vessel carrying grain or preserved goods represented a carefully calculated risk. Hoover worked with naval and civilian officials to ensure that shipping resources were used efficiently, assigning cargo space based on strategic need rather than convenience. Though decisions often required adjusting plans with little notice, he approached each change with composure, focusing on sustaining stability rather than perfecting a single method. Throughout the country, citizens participated in conservation efforts with growing consistency. Households adapted recipes, farmers expanded production, and factories adjusted their schedules to support national goals. Hoover observed these developments with steady appreciation, noting the effectiveness of voluntary cooperation when guided by clear purpose. The Food Administration issued pamphlets that explained practical steps families could take, all written in the calm, instructive tone that matched Hoover's leadership style. These materials did not dramatize conditions or play upon emotion. Instead, they offered structured guidance suited to a population eager to contribute. Under Hoover's direction, agricultural production increased significantly. Wheat exports rose to levels previously unseen, and the steady flow of food to Europe helped sustain civilian populations as well as military forces. The success of the program did not eliminate hardship overseas, yet it provided essential support during a period when shortages might otherwise have become severe. The administration's work demonstrated that careful planning, combined with public cooperation, could meet the demands of wartime without relying solely on compulsory measures. Hoover's leadership also extended to the stabilization of food prices. Unregulated markets during wartime could easily lead to sharp fluctuations, creating uncertainty for farmers and consumers alike. the Food Administration introduced measures to ensure fairness, preventing extreme increases that might burden families while still allowing farmers to maintain sustainable incomes. Hoover balanced these considerations with a calm sense of proportion, seeking a path that supported national unity without imposing undue strain on any one group. His approach emphasized education rather than enforcement. He believed that individuals, when provided with clear information and steady encouragement, would adjust their habits for the benefit of the larger community. This belief was rooted in the values of his upbringing: self-discipline, responsibility, and a quiet regard for the needs of others. During the war, these principles found expression in a national effort that drew upon millions of people working together, each contributing in small, consistent ways. As months passed, Hoover's responsibilities expanded. He advised government officials on agricultural planning, collaborated with Allied representatives on international distribution schedules, and oversaw programs that provided relief to areas recovering from the conflict. His work did not diminish in intensity after the armistice. Many regions of Europe faced continued shortages due to disrupted harvests, damaged infrastructure, and displaced populations. Hoover extended the Food Administration's operations temporarily to address these needs, ensuring that the transition from wartime management to post-war assistance occurred with steady coordination. These efforts underscored the central qualities of Hoover's leadership. He approached each situation, whether domestic conservation or international relief, with methodical patience. He did not seek attention or dramatize the challenges before him. Instead, he remained focused on the systems that sustained daily life, and believing that calm organization could uphold stability during uncertain times. His work during the war and the month that followed demonstrated a practical form of humanitarianism grounded in logistics, planning, and quiet resolve. By the end of his service with the Food Administration, Hoover had gained national recognition not through political activity, but through administrative competence. Many Americans associated his name with the steady guidance that had shaped their daily habits throughout the war. Internationally, he was known for orchestrating relief programs that had helped millions of civilians. These achievements marked a transition in his public identity. The engineer who had once travelled across continents to study geological formations was now viewed as a capable administrator whose work touched the lives of people far beyond the mining industry. This period also shaped Hoover's understanding of public service. He had witnessed how government agencies could function effectively when guided by clear purpose and disciplined organisation. He had seen how global developments influence local conditions and how the cooperation of ordinary citizens could sustain large-scale programs. These insights would remain with him, influencing decisions in the years ahead as he moved from humanitarian work into national governance. When the armistice of 1918 brought an end to the fighting in Europe, the cessation of military conflict did not immediately restore stability to the continent. Entire regions faced shortages caused by years of disrupted harvests, damaged transportation networks, and dislocated populations. As nations attempted to rebuild their economies and governments, food scarcity continued to threaten daily life for millions. Herbert Hoover, having already overseen extensive wartime relief and national food organization, was asked to direct an even broader effort, one that sought to support a continent emerging slowly from the strains of war. Hoover accepted this responsibility with the same calm steadiness that had characterized his earlier service. He understood that the challenges ahead would require careful planning, patient negotiation, and an unwavering commitment to practical solutions. His task involved coordinating the distribution of food and essential supplies across dozens of territories, or each with unique needs and circumstances. Many regions lacked functioning administrative structures, and communication lines were only beginning to reopen. Yet Hoover approached the situation without haste. establishing methods that allowed relief work to unfold in an orderly, sustainable manner. He began by assessing the conditions of European nations most affected by shortages. Teams travelled to urban and rural areas, recording information about crop failures, destroyed infrastructure, and the capacity of local authorities to receive and distribute aid. Hoover reviewed these reports with disciplined attention, drawing upon his long-standing habit of basing decisions on reliable data rather than assumption. This approach enabled relief organizations to form accurate plans regarding the quantities of wheat, fats, sugar, and other essentials required by each region. Shipping remained central to the success of the program. Ports damaged during the war needed to be restored to minimal functionality before large shipments could arrive. Hoover coordinated with naval authorities, shipping companies, and government ministries to ensure that transport vessels carried supplies steadily to the areas where they were needed most. The logistics involved were extensive. Some ports handled only small cargoes, requiring multiple voyages. Others supported larger shipments but needed improved storage facilities. Hoover's methodical oversight ensured that supplies were not merely shipped, but also positioned for effective distribution once they reached land. Railways within Europe also required attention. Many lines had suffered significant damage, while others had fallen into disrepair due to wartime neglect. Without functioning transport routes, food deliveries could not reach inland populations. Hoover worked with engineers, administrators, and local officials to identify the most urgent repairs and to allocate resources accordingly. He understood that restoring transportation infrastructure was as important as delivering food itself. These efforts, though gradual, helped reopen channels that linked farms, warehouses, and cities, allowing normal economic activity to begin slowly re-emerging. Throughout this period, Hoover maintained a clear distinction between humanitarian work and political affairs. Newly formed governments were adjusting to post-war boundaries and responsibilities, and many regions faced internal debate about how best to rebuild. Hoover focused strictly on relief, offering assistance without prescribing political direction. This neutrality helped foster cooperation across borders and created a foundation for trust that proved essential for the program's success. The needs of children received particular emphasis in Hoover's planning. Schools in several countries remained closed or operated only intermittently due to shortages. Hoover organized programs that supplied meals to children regardless of political affiliation or economic circumstance. These efforts aimed to prevent long-term health consequences caused by extended deprivation. The meals were simple, yet they were consistent, reflecting Hoover's belief that small, reliable measures could sustain communities through difficult periods. As winter approached in the first year after the war, that relief work expanded to include fuel distribution in regions facing dangerously low supplies. Coal shortages had become common, leaving families without reliable means of heating their homes. Hoover coordinated with mining operations and transport authorities to ensure that essential quantities reached the coldest areas. Though the effort did not eliminate hardship entirely, it provided enough regular support to help many households endure the colder months. Hoover's responsibilities also extended to financial management. Relief programs required coordination among governments, banks, and charitable organizations. Many European nations lacked the currency reserves needed to purchase supplies, and loans or credit agreements had to be arranged with sensitivity to each country's economic condition. Hoover facilitated these agreements quietly, focusing not on negotiation in the diplomatic sense but on identifying practical means by which transactions could occur. He remained attentive to stability rather than debt accumulation, ensuring that nations received support appropriate to their circumstances. In addition to food and fuel relief, Hoover oversaw measures designed to revive agricultural production. Seeds, tools, and livestock were distributed to regions where war had depleted farming resources. He believed that long-term stability depended on restoring each nation's capacity to feed itself. These agricultural programs were not dramatic in appearance. They unfolded slowly as farmers prepared soil, planted crops, and began rebuilding herds. Yet they formed a cornerstone of recovery, a gradually reducing reliance on imported supplies. Despite the scale of his responsibilities, Hoover maintained a steady, composed presence. He travelled to various European regions to observe conditions firsthand, meeting with local officials and relief workers. During these visits, he listened carefully, gathering information without imposing rapid judgments. The insights gained during these travels helped refine relief strategies and ensured that each measure reflected the realities of those living through recovery. By 1920, much of Europe had begun to move toward a more stable footing. While challenges persisted, the most severe shortages had been eased through coordinated effort. Hoover's leadership played a central role in maintaining the quiet continuity required for these programs to function effectively. His reliance on clear systems, disciplined planning, and calm cooperation provided a model for future international relief efforts. The work he completed in the years immediately following the war strengthened his belief that practical organization could help bridge divides created by conflict. It also demonstrated that humanitarian action, when approached with care and neutrality, could support recovery on a continental scale. These experiences further broadened his path, preparing him for responsibilities that would soon arise within his own country, as its government sought leadership capable of applying these same qualities to national administration. As the 1920s began, Herbert Hoover returned to the United States with a reputation shaped not by political movements, but by practical humanitarian achievements. His work in Europe had shown that he could bring order to vast, complex systems, and that he approached responsibility with a steady discipline grounded in evidence rather than sentiment. When President Warren G. Harding sought to assemble a cabinet capable of guiding the country through a period of economic and industrial transition, he invited Hoover to join the administration as Secretary of Commerce. After careful reflection, Hoover accepted, thus entering formal public service for the first time. The United States Department of Commerce during this era was still a relatively young institution. Its purpose was to support the nation's commercial activities, collect accurate data, promote standardized practices, and encourage coordinated development across industries. Now, Hoover approached these responsibilities with a sense of method drawn from years of managing complex international operations. He believed deeply in the value of organization and efficiency, and he saw the department as a means to help American industry grow in a manner that was orderly, informed, and scientifically grounded. Upon taking office in 1921, Hoover began by strengthening the department's capacity for gathering and analyzing information. He understood that sound policy depended on accurate knowledge of production, transportation, labor conditions, and market trends. Under his guidance, the department expanded its statistical services, creating clearer reports that could be used by businesses, local governments, and federal agencies alike. These documents were written with a focus on clarity and precision, reflecting Hoover's belief that reliable information formed the foundation of national economic stability. One of Hoover's central aims was to encourage standardization. At a time when industries across the country produced goods with varying measurements and specifications, inefficiencies often arose in manufacturing, shipping, and construction. Hoover worked with engineers, manufacturers, and trade associations to develop standardized sizes and practices that would reduce waste and improve coordination. These efforts extended to building materials, machinery parts, and consumer products. The result was a gradual increase in uniformity across industries, making production more predictable and decreasing costs. Hoover considered this a quiet but essential contribution to national efficiency. The Secretary of Commerce also took a measured interest in infrastructure. He supported the advancement of road systems necessary for the growing number of automobiles, and he encouraged modernized port facilities capable of handling expanding international trade. He did not direct these developments in a commanding manner. Instead, he facilitated cooperation among states, municipalities, and private companies, believing that voluntary collaboration would lead to durable progress. His office became known as a place where industry leaders could exchange ideas, coordinate plans, and receive guidance grounded in practical knowledge rather than political alignment. Aviation, still in its early stages, also drew Hoover's attention. Recognizing the potential of air travel and air commerce, he encouraged the formulation of standards and safety regulations that would allow the industry to grow responsibly. Through conferences and advisory committees, he helped lay groundwork for a national aviation policy, emphasizing the need for mapping air routes, developing reliable equipment, and training pilots systematically. These early efforts contributed quietly to the eventual maturation of commercial aviation in the decades that followed. Another emerging field under Hoover's leadership was radio communication. Radio was becoming a powerful means of transmitting information, yet its growth was haphazard, with stations broadcasting on overlapping frequencies and without consistent regulation. Hoover convened conferences aimed at establishing orderly use of the airwaves, like promoting a system in which frequencies would be allocated carefully to avoid interference. Though the authority of the Commerce Department was limited, his efforts reflected a belief that modernization required not only technological advancement, but also thoughtful coordination. During the administrations of both Harding and his successor, Calvin Coolidge, Hoover remained a consistent presence in the federal government. His approach was methodical rather than political. He viewed the role of government as a facilitator of cooperation and a collector of accurate information, not as a primary driver of economic activity. His emphasis on voluntary standards aligned well with the prevailing attitudes of the era, which favored limited federal intervention. Yet within these boundaries, Hoover demonstrated how organization and planning could improve efficiency without imposing rigid controls. His analytical perspective also extended to national emergencies. When severe flooding affected regions along the Mississippi River in 1927, Hoover was asked to coordinate relief and recovery efforts. Drawing upon his earlier humanitarian experience, he traveled to affected areas, organized committees, and supported measures to reinforce levees and protect communities. His work during the floods strengthened his public reputation, illustrating his capacity to bring steady leadership to situations that required both logistical clarity and quiet reassurance. Throughout his years as Secretary of Commerce, Hoover maintained the habits of study and reflection that had guided him since childhood. He reviewed data carefully, met regularly with experts across industries, and approached each issue with the same deliberate calm. He did not seek public acclaim, but his consistent presence and practical accomplishments gradually made him one of the most recognized figures within the federal government. Many saw in him a symbol of efficiency and reliability, an administrator who favored constructive solutions over political debate. By the late 1920s, Hoover had become closely associated with national prosperity. Though the country's economic growth resulted from many factors beyond federal administration, his role in encouraging modern practices and organized cooperation contributed to the general sense of forward movement. Business leaders respected his guidance. Farmers valued his efforts to collect and share agricultural information. And ordinary citizens saw in him a figure connected to practical improvements in daily life. These years marked a significant chapter in Hoover's public service. From the corridors of the Commerce Department, he demonstrated how administrative leadership could shape national development quietly and steadily. His experience in the cabinet expanded his understanding of government processes, public expectations, and the relationship between federal agencies and private enterprise. Without seeking the spotlight, he had become a central figure in national life, and the qualities he displayed during this period, discipline, neutrality, and calm coordination, would soon lead him toward even greater responsibilities. By the mid-1920s, Herbert Hoover had become a figure of quiet prominence in American public life. His work as Secretary of Commerce had revealed a capacity for disciplined administration and clear organization, qualities that appealed to a nation experiencing rapid economic growth. Hoover had not cultivated a political following, nor had he positioned himself in the traditional manner of aspiring candidates. Instead, his reputation emerged from steady service, technical competence, and an unhurried dedication to public welfare. These traits gradually led many to view him as a potential national leader, suited to the evolving demands of the era. During the presidency of Calvin Coolidge, Hoover's responsibilities continued to expand in subtle ways. Coolidge valued restraint in federal activity, yet he also recognized Hoover's ability to bring order to complex administrative matters without overstepping institutional boundaries. Yet, as Hoover coordinated conferences, advised industries, and participated in national planning, he developed relationships with business leaders, agricultural representatives, and state officials. These connections were practical rather than political. They reflected the needs of a growing country adjusting to technological change, expanding markets, and shifting social patterns. The public, observing Hoover's involvement in both domestic matters and international relief efforts, began associating his name with reliability. Newspapers described him as a symbol of organizational efficiency, though Hoover himself remained measured in his communication, avoiding declarations that might suggest political ambition. He published reports, delivered carefully constructed speeches, and participated in professional gatherings, and always maintaining a focus on administrative clarity rather than personal promotion. As the presidential election of 1928 approached, the political landscape began to shift. President Coolidge announced that he did not intend to seek another term, opening the field for new leadership. Within the Republican Party, various figures considered entering the race, yet many party members turned naturally toward Hoover. His reputation, built over years of service, had created an impression of steady capability. Industrial leaders appreciated his organizational methods. Farmers respected his efforts to collect and share agricultural data. And those who remembered his wartime and post-war relief work regarded him as someone who responded to large responsibilities with quiet resolve. Hoover did not immediately declare his candidacy. He understood the weight of national office and approached the possibility with characteristic caution. Advisors and colleagues encouraged him, noting that the public associated his name with prosperity and modern administration. Gradually, Hoover signaled his willingness to accept the nomination if the party considered him the appropriate choice. His decision was framed not in terms of personal ambition, but in the context of service, reflecting the values he had carried since childhood. When the Republican convention convened, Hoover's nomination proceeded with broad support. Delegates viewed him as a figure capable of sustaining the general economic optimism of the decade while guiding the nation thoughtfully into future developments. The platform emphasized continued stability, administrative efficiency, and responsible national planning, areas in which Hoover's experience was clearly visible. The general election placed Hoover against the Democratic nominee, Al Smith, the governor of New York. The contrast between the two candidates reflected regional, cultural, and political differences within the country, but Hoover maintained a calm and measured presence throughout the campaign. He did not employ dramatic rhetoric or personal criticism. Instead, he emphasized themes of cooperation, modernization, and national progress, drawing upon the administrative accomplishments of his years in the Commerce Department. His campaign speeches described the nation's economic development in terms of coordination between government and private enterprise. He spoke of scientific management, improved efficiency, and the possibilities offered by new technologies. These ideas were presented in a reflective, almost instructional tone, consistent with his long-standing approach to public communication. Rather than promising sweeping change, he articulated a vision of steady improvement grounded in practical methods. Across the country, voters responded to Hoover's record. They remembered his role in wartime relief, his work during domestic emergencies, and his leadership within the Commerce Department. In industrial centres, agricultural regions, and growing suburban communities, many viewed him as a figure who understood the needs of a modernizing nation. His message aligned with the general sense of confidence that characterized the late 1920s. In November 1928, Hoover won the election by a wide margin. His victory reflected both the public's trust in his administrative abilities and the broader mood of national optimism. After years of service that had unfolded quietly in the background of national life, he now prepared to assume the highest office in the United States. He approached the transition with deliberate care, surrounding himself with advisors and preparing to shift from the focused responsibilities of a cabinet position to the broader demands of the presidency. These months marked a turning point in Hoover's life. The path that had begun in the quiet town of West Branch had moved through the mining fields of distant continents and had expanded into humanitarian and administrative service, now brought him to a role that would require every measure of patience and discipline he possessed. The qualities that had guided him thus far, restraint, precision, and steadiness, remained central as he stepped toward the responsibilities that awaited in the White House. The presidential election of 1928 unfolded during a period of noticeable prosperity in the United States. Industries were expanding, technological advancements were becoming part of daily life, and the economic optimism of the decade gave many citizens a sense of steady progress. Against this backdrop, Herbert Hoover entered the national campaign not as a fiery orator or a political strategist, but as a quiet administrator whose reputation had been built through years of practical service. His candidacy reflected a belief, widely shared at the time, that competence, restraint, and methodical thinking could guide the nation into its next chapter. Hoover's opponent, Al Smith, was a respected figure with a long record of public service, known for his work as governor of New York. The two men represented contrasting backgrounds and styles. Smith conveyed warmth, directness, and a connection with urban constituencies. Hoover, in contrast, projected a reserved demeanour shaped by engineering work, humanitarian administration, and cabinet service. Yet despite their differences, both candidates approached the campaign with a commitment to orderly governance. Hoover's campaign emphasized steady national development rather than dramatic change. He presented the economic progress of the 1920s as evidence of a country advancing through coordination between industry and government. He spoke of the potential for continued growth through scientific management, improved agricultural resources, and expanded infrastructure. These messages were delivered in a calm, measured style. He avoided emotional appeals, preferring detailed explanations rooted in the practical experience he had accumulated over decades. Supporters of Hoover highlighted his leadership during wartime and post-war relief efforts, portraying him as a figure who applied disciplined planning to difficult circumstances. His organizational work in the Commerce Department further strengthened the perception that he possessed the skills needed to oversee national development. The argument in his favor was straightforward, that a period of prosperity required a leader capable of maintaining stability and extending the practical efficiencies that had characterized the decade. Well, one of the distinctive elements of the 1928 election was the expansion of radio as a campaigning medium. Hoover addressed the nation through radio broadcasts, speaking with reflective clarity. These messages reached households across the country, bringing his subdued style directly into living rooms. His voice, though not dramatic, conveyed a sense of thoughtful assurance. He offered explanations of economic trends, discussed the coordination of government and private enterprise, and emphasized the responsibilities of a modern, interconnected society. The political climate of the election also reflected deeper cultural and regional differences. Smith, as a Catholic candidate, faced opposition from some voters who feared change to long-standing traditions. Hoover, who did not engage in such controversies, remained focused on themes of administration, organization, and national cooperation. His ability to remain distant from divisive rhetoric contributed to his image as a steady and unifying presence. Across rural communities, industrial centers, and emerging suburban areas, Hoover's message found broad support. Farmers responded to his emphasis on agricultural research and systematic resource management. Manufacturers appreciated his record of encouraging standardization and efficiency. Many ordinary citizens valued his history of humanitarian service, recalling the efforts that had helped feed millions during and after the First World War. Though Hoover himself did not emphasize these achievements for political effect, they quietly shaped public perception. In the final weeks of the campaign, momentum remained firmly in Hoover's favor. Polling methods of the era were limited, yet newspaper reports and public gatherings suggested widespread approval of his candidacy. Supporters viewed him as a symbol of practical progress and rational governance. The confidence of the period influenced the way many interpreted his message. He seemed to embody the orderly optimism of the age, a figure capable of guiding prosperity with careful judgment. On election day, the results confirmed the prevailing expectation. Hoover won by a substantial margin, securing a majority of states and achieving strong support in both urban and rural regions. His victory represented not only personal achievement, but also the culmination of a national belief in organized, efficient administration as the guiding principle for continued growth. And newspapers described the outcome as a reflection of public trust in Hoover's steadiness and competence. Yet even as the country celebrated the peaceful transition of leadership, Hoover remained characteristically restrained. He expressed appreciation for the confidence placed in him, and began preparing for the responsibilities of the presidency with methodical attention. He reviewed reports, consulted advisers, and considered the challenges ahead. His thoughts turned to agriculture, industry, and infrastructure, areas he believed could benefit from careful planning and coordinated support. The months between the election and the inauguration unfolded quietly. Hoover studied administrative procedures, reviewed federal structures, and reflected on how to apply the principles of order and efficiency that had guided his service. He approached the presidency not as an opportunity for personal prominence, but as a responsibility requiring disciplined thought, patience, and the willingness to serve the country in a time of continued transformation. Thus, the election of 1928 marked the final step on Hoover's path from modest beginnings in Iowa to the highest office in the nation. His journey had been defined by measured achievement rather than political maneuvering, and his rise to the presidency was seen as the natural culmination of a life dedicated to organization, precision, and public service. As he prepared to take office, the calm certainty that had shaped his career remained intact, guiding him toward the next chapter of his life. When Herbert Hoover took the oath of office in March 1929, he entered the presidency with a clear sense of administrative purpose. His approach reflected decades of experience in engineering, humanitarian work, and cabinet service. He viewed government not as a source of constant intervention, but as a mechanism through which organisation, research, and cooperative planning could support the country's continued development. As he settled into the White House, Hoover began shaping an agenda grounded in the principles that had guided his public life: efficiency, voluntary coordination, and the use of scientific knowledge to improve national systems. From the earliest days of his presidency, Hoover encouraged a structured relationship between public agencies and private industries. He believed that cooperation could help address national challenges without undermining individual initiative. Advisory committees were formed to study subjects ranging from transportation networks to industrial safety. These groups gathered data, conducted analyses, and offered recommendations aimed at making various sectors more efficient. Hoover supported these efforts quietly, allowing experts to guide discussions while he oversaw the overall framework of coordination. Infrastructure remained one of his interests. Hoover envisioned improvements in water management, flood control, and transportation systems that would benefit both rural and urban communities. He encouraged studies of river basins, recognizing that thoughtful planning could reduce the risk of future disasters. He supported the expansion of highways and the modernization of public works, believing that these initiatives, approached methodically, would contribute to long-term national strength. His vision emphasized quiet, steady progress rather than dramatic transformation. Agriculture, a central part of American life, also occupied Hoover's attention. Farmers had faced difficulties throughout the 1920s, including declining prices and changing global markets. Hoover approached these challenges by promoting cooperative marketing, improved agricultural research, and better information sharing systems. He believed that detailed knowledge of supply and demand could help stabilize markets. Rather than imposing strict controls, he encouraged farmers' organizations to adopt practices that would reduce volatility. His efforts reflected a belief that economic solutions should arise from informed collaboration rather than immediate regulation. Hoover's early presidency also marked advances in technology and communications. Radio broadcasting continued to grow, offering new possibilities for information exchange. Hoover supported thoughtful planning in this area, favoring organized frequency allocation and the development of communication standards. He approached this emerging field with the same calm respect for structure he had demonstrated during his years at the Commerce Department. Aviation similarly drew continued attention. As commercial airlines developed, Hoover encouraged the creation of consistent safety guidelines and navigational aids that would support orderly growth. Another area of focus involved public health. Hoover supported efforts to study disease prevention, sanitation practices, and nutrition. He believed that improving public health required a mixture of scientific research and practical education. Programs were encouraged that provided communities with information about hygiene, healthy foods, and medical practices. Although these initiatives unfolded gradually, they reflected Hoover's belief that government could play a constructive role in strengthening daily life through knowledge rather than mandate. Hoover's administrative vision extended to the broader idea of national planning. He encouraged research into economic trends, believing that careful analysis could help the country anticipate changes rather than react to them. He supported proposals to gather more detailed information about employment, production, and trade. His hope was that with better data, industries could coordinate their activities more effectively, reducing the abrupt cycles that had long characterized economic life. This emphasis on information reflected the habits he had carried throughout his career, an understanding that clear decisions arise from steady observation. Social issues also received Hoover's attention. He encouraged discussions about prison reform, child welfare, and labor conditions, emphasizing improvements that could be achieved through collaborative study. He believed that communities supported by research and guidance were capable of addressing many social challenges without heavy federal intervention. His approach was gradual, grounded in a sense of responsibility to promote well-being while respecting the limits of government authority. Public expectations during the early months of Hoover's term were high. Many citizens viewed him as a symbol of national competence, a leader capable of guiding prosperity through careful stewardship. His speeches reflected these expectations in a measured way. He spoke of the importance of organization, the potential of scientific methods, and the value of cooperation in a modern society. He described government not as a force for dramatic intervention, but as a partner that could help coordinate progress. These messages aligned with the general optimism of the time, offering reassurance that the nation's steady growth would continue. Hoover's presidency began, therefore, with a sense of calm purpose. The initiatives he supported reflected a consistent philosophy that efficiency, clarity, and voluntary coordination could bring about improvements that would endure. Then his administrative vision relied on structure rather than force, on information rather than impulse. In these early months, the country appeared poised for continued prosperity, and Hoover's methodical approach seemed well suited to the moment. Yet beyond the surface of national confidence, changes were beginning to emerge in financial markets and economic conditions. These developments were not yet widely recognized, and Hoover continued to pursue his plans for cooperative advancement. The early period of his presidency thus stands as a moment of quiet intention, shaped by the belief that organized effort could guide the nation steadily forward. It was a moment defined by hopefulness and structure, preceding the challenges that would soon alter the course of his administration. As the year 1929 progressed, if the United States continued to appear outwardly prosperous, industries produced at high levels, new technologies shaped daily routines, and many citizens believed the nation had entered a period of lasting economic stability. Yet beneath this optimism lay patterns that were less certain. Stock prices had risen sharply for several years, outpacing the growth of underlying industries. Credit was readily available, and many individuals increasingly purchased stocks on margin, relying on borrowed funds to finance investments. These trends developed gradually, and while some observers expressed caution, the general atmosphere remained confident. President Herbert Hoover, who had taken office only months earlier, focused on encouraging cooperative planning among industries and improving national systems through measured administrative effort. He was aware of the need for economic balance, yet he, like many others, did not foresee the scale of the shift that would soon occur. His early months in office were filled with routine administrative tasks, reports on agricultural conditions, discussions about infrastructure, and reflections on long-term planning. The mood of the country, still shaped by years of growth, did not readily suggest impending disruption. In late October, the atmosphere of the financial markets changed sharply. A series of rapid declines in stock prices unsettled investors who had grown accustomed to steady gains. Selling increased as individuals and institutions attempted to protect their holdings. The pace of transactions accelerated, and the markets experienced days when the volume of trading exceeded anything seen before. Prices fell quickly across a wide range of stocks, and the sense of stability that had characterized earlier years gave way to uncertainty. Hoover received reports as the events unfolded, but the situation developed more rapidly than administrative systems could fully absorb. He responded in the manner consistent with his temperament, calmly, methodically, and with quiet attention to the underlying facts. He consulted financial officials, spoke with business leaders, and gathered information to understand the extent of the decline. He encouraged banks and industrial groups to maintain cooperation and resist the pressures that might deepen instability. His public statements were measured, intended to reassure without overstating conditions or dismissing the seriousness of unfolding events. The decline in stock prices did not immediately affect all sectors of the economy. Factories continued operating, farms remained engaged in harvests, and many essential services continued their routines without interruption. Yet the financial contraction began to place pressure on institutions that depended on credit. Banks with extensive market exposure faced strain, and businesses that had borrowed heavily during years of growth found themselves adjusting to new realities. Hoover approached these developments with deliberate care, working to stabilize public confidence while examining possible measures to support economic resilience. He convened meetings with bankers and industrial leaders, encouraging them to sustain employment levels and maintain investment where possible. His approach reflected long-standing beliefs about voluntary cooperation, that coordinated effort among private institutions could help uphold economic stability. He urged companies not to reduce wages and encouraged continued purchasing by commercial groups. These conversations, though calm, acknowledged the seriousness of the challenge. Hoover emphasized that coordinated action could mitigate the effects of financial decline, even as the full implications of the market drop were not yet apparent. The stock market crash represented not a single event, but a series of interconnected disruptions. As prices fell, individuals who had purchased stocks on margin were compelled to sell, creating further downward pressure. Banks tightened credit and uncertainty influenced decisions across industries. Hoover continued receiving updates, reviewing each with the same disciplined attention characteristic of his administrative style. He didn't approach the situation with haste or alarm, but with a steady focus on understanding the broader picture and identifying measured responses. In the weeks that followed, Hoover issued statements encouraging calm and confidence. He believed that stability could be restored through collective restraint and thoughtful action. His words were intended to reassure without minimizing the seriousness of conditions. He remained attentive to agricultural markets, transportation networks, and employment trends, understanding that shifts in these areas could reveal the deeper impact of the financial downturn. His approach reflected a belief that economic systems, when supported by voluntary cooperation, could regain balance. As winter approached, the early effects of the crash began to be felt more widely. Some businesses reduced operations, banks faced increasing pressure, and regions dependent on particular industries experienced gradual strain. Hoover continued meeting with advisors, seeking ways to encourage investment and uphold employment. He did not advocate drastic intervention, consistent with his belief that order and stability emerge through structured cooperation rather than direct federal control. His administration instead focused on gathering information, advising private institutions, and supporting public works planning that could sustain activity during uncertain times. The events of late 1929 marked a transition not only in the economic life of the nation, but also in Hoover's presidency. The calm administrative vision that had guided his early months now existed alongside an expanding series of challenges. Though the full scale of the economic difficulties ahead remained unclear, the stock market crash signaled the beginning of a period that would require patience, resilience, and continued reliance on methodical judgment. The shift from national optimism to emerging uncertainty unfolded gradually, and Hoover faced it with the same quiet composure that had defined his career. The steady habits he'd cultivated over decades, careful observation, reliance on data, and belief in cooperative effort, continued to shape his response. These qualities, while consistent, would soon be tested by circumstances far beyond the expectations of the era. As the 1930s opened, the effects of the stock market crash began unfolding across the country in ways that were gradual yet unmistakable. factories that had once operated at full capacity started to reduce production. Railroads carried fewer goods, banks faced increasing withdrawals, and agricultural prices, already low before the crash, began drifting downward. The decline did not arrive suddenly. Instead, it spread through the economy in slow, widening circles, touching industries, towns, and households with a quiet but persistent weight. Herbert Hoover, still early in his term as president, observed these developments with disciplined concern, seeking methods to encourage stability while adhering to the belief that cooperative action could guide the nation through difficulty. Hoover understood that the situation required thoughtful coordination. He convened conferences with business leaders, urging them to maintain wages and continue employment wherever possible. He encouraged industrial groups to avoid sudden reductions that might deepen uncertainty. These meetings emphasized voluntary cooperation rather than compulsion, reflecting Hoover's conviction that stability grew from shared responsibility rather than statutory command. For a time, some industries honored these pledges, hoping that the downturn would ease as confidence returned. Yet as conditions worsened, the strain on companies became increasingly difficult to bear. Agriculture remained a central area of concern. Farmers had entered the decade with burdens carried over from earlier years: low commodity prices, regional overproduction, and limited access to credit. The deepening recession magnified these pressures. Hoover encouraged agricultural organizations to adopt collective marketing practices and supported the expansion of research efforts aimed at improving crop yields and soil conditions. He sought to strengthen the existing framework of the Federal Farm Board, urging cooperative action to stabilize prices. Yet the forces weakening the farm economy extended beyond any local or national program, driven by declines in global markets and the accumulated weight of debt. Banks faced their own challenges. As loans became difficult to repay and depositors grew uneasy, institutions in some regions struggled to remain solvent. Hoover responded by supporting the development of mechanisms designed to strengthen financial stability. He encouraged the creation of the National Credit Corporation, through which stronger banks could assist weaker ones. These measures reflected his belief in using cooperative structures to maintain order within the financial system. Although the corporation offered some support, the scale of economic contraction continued to exceed the capacity of voluntary efforts. Public works projects formed another part of Hoover's approach. He encouraged federal agencies to accelerate construction already planned, believing that steady employment in infrastructure would help offset declines in private industry. Roads, dams, and public buildings proceeded at a measured pace, intended to provide both immediate work and long-term national benefit. Hoover was careful to distinguish these efforts from programs designed to reshape the role of government. He viewed them instead as practical measures consistent with federal responsibility for public assets. Despite these actions, economic conditions continued to deteriorate. Unemployment rose gradually, then more sharply. Cities faced increasing demands on local relief organizations, which attempted to distribute food, clothing, and housing support. Hoover emphasized the importance of community and state-level assistance, maintaining his belief that the federal government should not assume primary responsibility for relief. He feared that doing so might weaken existing civic structures and undermine traditional forms of mutual support. This view, shaped by decades of reliance on voluntarism, influenced many of his decisions during these years. International developments added further difficulty. The global depression affected trade, restricted access to foreign markets, and disrupted financial relationships between nations. Hoover proposed a one-year moratorium on international debt payments, hoping that this measure would stabilize the financial systems of countries affected by earlier war obligations. The proposal, known as the Hoover Moratorium, received cautious acceptance from various governments and provided temporary relief, though the broader forces of economic decline continued to press heavily on global commerce. Throughout this period, Hoover maintained a steady, composed presence. He reviewed reports carefully, met regularly with advisors, and searched for ways to support economic recovery without abandoning his commitment to cooperative effort. His public statements emphasized resilience and calm, encouraging citizens to retain confidence in the nation's capacity to endure hardship. He resisted calls for expansive federal relief programs, believing that such measures, while potentially helpful in the short term, might alter the balance between government and private life in ways he considered unsuitable for the country's long-term well-being. As conditions worsened, debate grew regarding the appropriate role of the federal government in addressing widespread unemployment and financial instability. Hoover acknowledged the severity of the crisis, yet remained cautious in expanding federal authority. He supported the establishment of the Reconstruction Finance Corporation in early 1932, an institution designed to provide loans to banks, railroads, and other essential businesses. This measure reflected a recognition that voluntary systems alone could not stabilize the economy, and it marked one of the most significant government interventions of his administration. Still, Hoover viewed the corporation as a temporary tool aimed at restoring confidence, rather than a departure from his core principles. By the end of his third year in office, the widening depression had become a defining element of national life. Factories operated below capacity. Families struggled to find work, and communities across the country faced challenges that deepened with each passing season. Hoover continued to apply his methodical approach, emphasizing cooperation, information, and careful planning. Yet the scale of the crisis, shaped by global forces as well as domestic conditions, made recovery slow and uncertain. The deepening depression marked a period of quiet gravity in Hoover's presidency, a contrast to the optimism with which his term had begun. His reliance on voluntary organization and administrative order reflected a lifelong philosophy shaped by engineering discipline, humanitarian experience, and respect for local initiative. These qualities, while consistent, encountered circumstances of exceptional difficulty. Circumstances that would continue to shape the closing years of his presidency and the nation's path forward. As Herbert Hoover moved through the later years of his presidency, he found himself balancing two forces that shaped nearly every decision he faced. On one side stood the urgent needs of millions of Americans affected by unemployment, failing businesses, and declining agriculture. On the other side lay his long-held belief that the nation's strength rested upon voluntary cooperation, local responsibility, and limited federal intervention. Navigating between these principles and the expanding demands of the crisis became the central challenge of this period, a challenge that unfolded slowly and steadily as economic hardship deepened across the country. Hoover continued to search for methods that could support recovery without disrupting the balance he believed essential to American civic life. He encouraged states and municipalities to organize relief committees, urging them to expand charitable activities and coordinate local resources. He believed sincerely that community-based assistance, built upon neighborly responsibility, could provide support in ways that preserved dignity and avoided long-term dependence. This approach reflected his deeply rooted upbringing in Quaker traditions of mutual aid and self-reliance. Yet as unemployment grew into the millions, the limits of local support became increasingly evident. The Reconstruction Finance Corporation, established in early 1932, became one of Hoover's principal tools of stabilizing weakened institutions. The corporation provided loans to banks, railroads, and certain state governments, attempting to reinforce the financial structures upon which economic recovery depended. Hoover believed that strengthening key institutions would allow credit to flow again, supporting businesses and eventually restoring employment. He regarded this approach not as an expansion of federal control, but as a temporary measure aimed at safeguarding the foundations of the economy. Despite these intentions, public perception grew more critical as the Depression persisted. Many citizens facing depleted savings and long periods without work have found it difficult to wait for indirect measures to take effect. Breadlines appeared in cities, farms faced foreclosures, and once busy industrial regions quieted noticeably. Hoover, aware of the suffering, continued to emphasize both compassion and restraint. He supported limited federal loans to states for relief purposes, but remained cautious about direct federal payments to individuals, fearing that such assistance could alter the traditional relationship between the citizen and the government. The gap between Hoover's principles and public expectations widened as conditions continued to decline. His speeches reflected a desire to encourage hope without promising what he believed would be excessive intervention. He spoke of cooperation, perseverance, and the importance of maintaining the nation's character during hardship. His tone remained measured, avoiding dramatic appeals. He continued to review economic reports, meet with advisors, and encourage industries to uphold employment when possible. Yet each month brought new signs of contraction, challenging the effectiveness of voluntary efforts. Agriculture remained an area of particular strain. In addition to low prices and declining exports, certain regions faced environmental hardship. With fields suffering from exhausted soil and erratic weather, farmers found it increasingly difficult to sustain their operations. Hoover supported measures to stabilize commodity prices through cooperative marketing and limited credit assistance. Yet these efforts were overshadowed by the broader forces affecting the national and international economy. In cities, the difficulties were more visible. Families that had once relied on steady wages now turned to local relief agencies. Shelters, food depots, and community organizations worked continuously to support those in need, but resources were often insufficient. Hoover remained committed to the idea that relief should originate at the local and state levels, supplemented by federal loans only when necessary. He believed this system preserved both community autonomy and individual morale. However, as demand increased, many local systems became overwhelmed, resulting in uneven support across the country. Public works projects, which Hoover had encouraged since the early months of his presidency, continued through this period. Bridges, highways, and public buildings progressed, offering employment to some workers. Yet Hoover regarded these initiatives as responsible uses of federal authority, projects that enhanced national infrastructure while providing work opportunities. Yet the scale of unemployment far exceeded the capacity of these programs, limiting their overall impact. Hoover's philosophical restraint was further tested by the growing debate within Congress. Some legislators advocated for expansive federal relief measures and broader public works programs, believing that only significant government action could counteract the Depression's effects. Hoover listened carefully to these proposals but remained cautious, concerned that sudden shifts in federal policy could create long-term obligations beyond the nation's means. His presidency had become a careful balancing act between immediate need and future responsibility, between compassion and caution. Despite the strain of these decisions, Hoover maintained his characteristic composure. He continued to study reports late into the evening, evaluate recommendations, and communicate with leaders across the country. His letters and speeches during this period reflected a steady conviction that the nation would recover through resilience and coordinated effort, even if that recovery proceeded slowly. He emphasized that the measures he supported were designed not only to address the present moment, but also to safeguard the country's future stability. By 1932, as the nation approached another presidential election, The contrast between Hoover's principles and public expectations had become a defining feature of national discussion. Many citizens respected his dedication and sincerity, yet others, facing mounting hardships, sought more immediate and expansive federal action. Hoover remained committed to the path he believed was both responsible and necessary, even as it grew increasingly difficult to reconcile that path with the realities before him. This period of hovering between relief and principle marked one of the most complex phases of Hoover's presidency. It revealed the depth of his administrative discipline, the consistency of his beliefs, and the challenges posed when long-held principles confronted unprecedented national hardship. As the months advanced toward the 1932 election, Hoover continued to navigate this delicate balance with the quiet steadiness that had characterized his entire career, even as the nation moved toward a moment of significant transition. As the year 1932 unfolded, the economic hardships facing the United States had become a defining element of daily life. Families across the country continued to struggle with unemployment, declining incomes, and uncertainty about the future. Against this backdrop, the nation approached a presidential election that carried a sense of gravity unlike those of previous decades. Herbert Hoover, having spent nearly 4 years navigating unprecedented economic challenges, prepared to face the electorate while remaining guided by the same principles that had shaped his presidency: cautious federal intervention, respect for local responsibility, and steadfast belief in cooperative action. Hoover did not seek to transform his public identity during the campaign. He maintained the calm, deliberate tone that had characterized his earlier service. Yet his speeches emphasized the measures his administration had undertaken: support for banks through the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, expanded public works, agricultural assistance, and encouragement of industrial cooperation. He explained these actions in terms of preserving the nation's long-term stability and avoiding decisions that might later restrict economic freedom or place excessive burdens on future generations. His message reflected a continuity of thought shaped by decades of administrative experience and personal conviction. Opposing Hoover was Franklin D. Roosevelt, the governor of New York, who offered a contrasting approach. Roosevelt spoke of a more active federal role in supporting the unemployed and revitalizing the economy. His speeches conveyed energy, optimism, and a willingness to explore new methods of relief and recovery. This contrast between Hoover's structured caution and Roosevelt's more expansive vision became central to the public conversation during the campaign. As Hoover traveled across the country, he encountered citizens facing unmistakable hardships. Communities that had once experienced steady prosperity now showed signs of exhaustion. Businesses stood empty in some towns, and farms across the Midwest continued to face falling prices and limited credit. Hoover listened attentively during his travels, acknowledging the strain felt by families and expressing sincere hope for the nation's recovery. Yet, he remained careful not to promise solutions that conflicted with his understanding of the federal government's proper role. He believed that the Depression, though severe, would eventually ease through perseverance, cooperation, and the gradual restoration of economic balance. Public sentiment, however, had shifted. Many citizens admired Hoover's sincerity and recognized the enormity of the challenges he faced, yet growing numbers sought more immediate assistance than voluntary cooperation and limited federal programs could offer. Roosevelt's assurances of new approaches and experimentation resonated with those longing for a sense of direction during uncertain times. As the campaign progressed, it became increasingly clear that the election would hinge not on personal regard alone, but on differing interpretations of the government's responsibilities during crisis. The voting results in November reflected this shift in national mood. Hoover lost by a significant margin, with Roosevelt carrying both urban and rural regions. The outcome was decisive yet peaceful, in keeping with the quiet continuity of American constitutional processes. Hoover received the results with characteristic composure. Though disappointed, he accepted the public's decision without hesitation, turning his attention toward ensuring an orderly transition of authority. The months between the election and the inauguration were marked by continued economic difficulty. Banks faced increasing strain, and the financial system showed signs of deeper instability. Hoover remained fully engaged in presidential duties during this period, seeking measures to bolster confidence and maintain essential functions of government. He communicated with Roosevelt, offering briefings on developments and encouraging cooperation before the transfer of power. Hoover hoped that coordinated action during these interim months might help sustain stability until new policies could be implemented. The relationship between the outgoing and incoming administrations, while respectful, reflected differences in philosophy. Hoover believed that early collaboration could ease the transition and perhaps prevent further financial deterioration. Roosevelt, preparing his own agenda and reluctant to commit to decisions before taking office, maintained a careful distance. Hoover approached these exchanges with steady patience, continuing to fulfill his responsibilities while respecting the boundaries of the transition process. Then, as March 1933 approached, the inauguration month used before the constitutional change to January, Hoover reflected on the path he had travelled. He had entered the presidency during a time of confidence and left during one of unprecedented national hardship. Throughout, he had remained true to his principles, even when public sentiment shifted against them. His belief in cooperative action, limited federal intervention, and the gradual restoration of economic balance had guided him through each decision, shaping both his actions and his understanding of public service. On the final day of his term, Hoover departed the White House quietly. The ceremonies of transfer proceeded with dignity, and he attended Roosevelt's inauguration with the solemnity appropriate to the occasion. The crowd, hopeful for the new administration, filled the nation's capital with anticipation. Hoover, observing the transition, recognized the significance of the moment while maintaining his reflective reserve. His presidency, marked by earnest effort amid extraordinary circumstances, had come to a close. The transition out of office signaled the end of one chapter in Hoover's public life, but not the conclusion of his service. He soon entered a period of thoughtful writing, travel, and eventual renewed contribution to national and international projects. Yet in 1933, as he stepped away from the presidency, he carried with him the quiet conviction that he had acted according to principle, guided by a lifetime of disciplined judgment and a sincere commitment to the well-being of the country. After leaving office in 1933, Herbert Hoover entered a quieter phase of his life, and is one marked by reflection, writing, and a gradual return to a more private existence. The urgency of daily presidential responsibilities receded, replaced by long stretches of time in which he could study, analyze, and consider the events he had witnessed from the vantage point of experience. Although he stepped away from public leadership, he didn't retreat from thoughtful engagement with national affairs. Instead, he approached this new chapter with the same disciplined steadiness that had defined his earlier years, allowing the pace of reflection to unfold naturally and without haste. In the weeks following the inauguration of his successor, Hoover returned to California for a period of rest. The landscapes of the American West, with their quiet expanses and natural rhythms, offered space for contemplation. He spent time with his family, participated in modest social gatherings, and reacquainted himself with the routines of ordinary life. Yet even in these peaceful surroundings, he remained attentive to the larger questions that had shaped his professional journey, questions about economic stability, public administration, and the ways nations respond to periods of difficulty. Hoover soon began to write. He possessed a lifelong interest in documentation, analysis, and careful explanation, and now he turned these habits toward reviewing his experiences in public service. With deliberate clarity, he examined the principles that had guided his presidency, the decisions shaped by economic conditions, and the broader forces influencing global development. His writing was neither hurried nor defensive. It reflected an individual accustomed to observing events with precision and forming conclusions through methodical study. Travel also became part of his life during these years. He visited friends across the country and attended various conferences, though always in a manner consistent with his quiet temperament. These travels allowed him to stay informed about national developments while maintaining the distance appropriate for a former president. He spoke occasionally at institutions that invited him to discuss economic or administrative matters, offering remarks that were reflective rather than political. His tone remained calm, grounded in his long-standing belief that patient study could illuminate pathways through complex challenges. During this time, Hoover also devoted attention to personal correspondence. Then, he wrote letters to colleagues, acquaintances, and public officials, offering thoughts on topics ranging from economic policy to public administration. These letters, precise in wording and steady in tone, revealed his continued engagement with the broader civic world. Though he no longer shaped national policy, he maintained an intellectual interest in the decisions unfolding across the country. His perspective, informed by years of experience, often emphasized the importance of stability, cooperation, and understated leadership. Hoover's distance from official responsibilities allowed him to witness the unfolding of new federal programs with thoughtful detachment. He observed the ambitious initiatives undertaken by the government during the early 1930s and reflected on their implications for the relationship between citizens and public institutions. His private writings show a mind carefully analysing these developments, considering their long-term effects while remaining respectful of differing viewpoints. These reflections provided him with material for future essays and speeches, composed in a tone that favoured historical perspective over immediate reaction. Despite the calm rhythm of this chapter, Hoover did not withdraw entirely from civic duty. When private organisations sought his guidance, he responded with the same measured counsel he had offered throughout his career. He participated in committees studying public policy issues, lent his expertise to charitable groups, and offered advice to individuals engaged in humanitarian work. These contributions were often quiet, marked not by public announcements, but by steady correspondence and thoughtful recommendations. His home life provided additional grounding during this period. Surrounded by family, Hoover experienced a return to the routines that had been disrupted during his years of public office. He spent time reading, organising documents from his extensive career, and reflecting on personal memories. The passing seasons brought calm transitions, offering a contrast to the intense activity of his recent presidency. The quietness of these days allowed him to rebuild a sense of inward balance, shaped by reflection rather than responsibility. Yet even in this quieter phase, Hoover retained the disciplined habits that had carried him through earlier decades. He maintained regular hours for study, kept careful notes, and approached each project, whether a letter, a speech, or a written analysis, with precision. Over time, he began shaping material that would later become significant contributions to historical literature, offering insights into the economic and administrative structures that had influenced events around the world. His reflections during these years served as the foundation for his future re-engagement with public service. Though he could not yet foresee the specific roles he would later assume, the steady rhythm of thought and study prepared him for the responsibilities that would eventually emerge. For now, however, This chapter remained one of distance, neither isolation nor withdrawal, but a calm step back from the burdens of office, allowing perspective to take form. In this period of quietness, Hoover moved gently between personal reflection and measured engagement with the world around him. Freed from the pressures of daily governance, he regained a slow, contemplative rhythm that enabled him to examine the past and consider the future with clarity. It was a time of reorientation, marking the beginning of a long and thoughtful phase in a life that still held many chapters yet to unfold. As the world moved into the late 1930s, Herbert Hoover, though living in relative quiet, observed international developments with careful attention. The rise of political tensions across Europe, the rearmament of nations, and the gradual collapse of diplomatic efforts reminded him of the conditions that had preceded the First World War. He followed events not as a policymaker, but as a seasoned observer whose earlier humanitarian service had unfolded within a similarly fragile landscape. Though no longer in public office, he remained attentive to the needs of civilian populations and the potential strains that global conflict might impose. When war returned to Europe in 1939, Hoover's concern deepened. Memories of the suffering he had witnessed during the previous conflict remained vivid. He understood how quickly food shortages could develop, how transportation systems could falter, and how vulnerable children and displaced families might become. These reflections shaped his response as nations began preparing for long years of struggle. Although the United States remained neutral during the conflict's early stages, Hoover believed that humanitarian assistance should continue wherever possible, provided it did not interfere with broader national policies. His early efforts focused on advocating for food relief to civilian populations trapped within war zones. He communicated with international organizations and charitable groups, offering guidance drawn from his extensive experience in logistics, procurement, and distribution. His letters remained calm in tone, emphasizing practicality and caution, while urging thoughtful consideration of humanitarian needs. He believed that even within the constraints of war, nations could act to prevent hunger and disease among non-combatants. These recommendations, though careful, reflected a consistent conviction that compassion and organizational clarity could mitigate suffering even during global upheaval. As American involvement in the war grew more likely, Hoover adopted a respectful distance from official decision-making. He did not seek public office, nor did he attempt to influence military strategy. Instead, he focused on areas where his experience remained most applicable. He studied food production trends, assessed potential supply challenges, and communicated with experts who sought to understand how global conflicts might affect agricultural systems. In this way, he contributed quietly to the growing body of knowledge that informed humanitarian planning. After the United States entered the war in 1941, Hoover continued to serve in an advisory capacity when asked, though he remained outside formal government structures. His correspondence with public officials reflected a measured tone, offering observations without insistence. He emphasized the importance of maintaining adequate nutrition for both domestic populations and allied nations, noting that wartime strain often revealed weaknesses in distribution networks. His guidance was grounded in clear reasoning and an understanding of the delicate balance between military needs and civilian well-being. Despite political differences that had emerged in earlier years, Hoover eventually found opportunities to work alongside leaders in the wartime administration. His role was not public or ceremonial. Instead, it involved quiet consultation on matters where his expertise in international relief and organizational planning could provide insight. He believed that effective humanitarian work required cooperation across political lines, and he approached these interactions with the same disciplined restraint that had characterized his entire life. As the war progressed, Hoover began thinking once more about the post-war world. He remembered the challenges faced in 1918, the shortages, the damaged infrastructure, the displaced populations, and he anticipated that similar needs would arise after the new conflict ended. With this in mind, he started drafting memoranda and essays that outlined potential relief programs, food distribution plans, and long-term measures to support recovery. These writings reflected a forward-looking perspective, shaped by decades of experience and a deep understanding of global interdependence. Later in the war, his expertise became increasingly relevant. The United States and its allies began considering how to assist liberated regions where food scarcity and disrupted agriculture were likely. Hoover contributed recommendations that emphasized efficiency, neutrality, and respect for local conditions. He stressed the importance of coordinating relief efforts through careful planning and international cooperation, drawing on lessons from both his earlier humanitarian work and his administrative experiences. Toward the end of the war, Hoover received an invitation from President Truman to assist in developing global food relief strategies. Despite differences in political background, the two men shared a mutual respect grounded in practical necessity. Hoover accepted doing so with quiet professionalism rather than public display. His return to national advisory work was not a revival of his political career, but a continuation of his lifelong commitment to humanitarian service. He offered guidance on how to distribute surplus food, how to manage shipping routes, and how to ensure that vulnerable regions received essential supplies during the first difficult years after the conflict. Hoover's participation in these efforts demonstrated the enduring relevance of his earlier experiences. His knowledge of global supply chains, his understanding of cooperative systems, and his disciplined approach to planning all contributed meaningfully to post-war relief initiatives. He did not seek recognition for his role. Instead, he worked steadily in the background, applying his skills to help ease the burdens faced by millions around the world. Throughout these years, he remained guided by a consistent belief that effective humanitarian action depended on organization, neutrality, and respect for the dignity of those receiving aid. The second global conflict, like the first, revealed the importance of these principles. Hoover's contributions during this period show that even after stepping away from public office, he continued to serve in ways aligned with his character, quietly, steadily, and with a deep sense of responsibility. In the years following the Second World War, Herbert Hoover continued to serve the nation in roles that drew upon his long experience with organization, administration, and efficiency. Though he had stepped away from electoral politics, his reputation as a thoughtful analyst of governmental structures remained intact. As the federal government expanded significantly during the war, questions naturally arose about how to improve its efficiency in peacetime. Recognizing Hoover's capacity for methodical assessment, President Truman invited him to lead a commission tasked with studying and recommending reforms to the executive branch. This group became known as the Hoover Commission. Hoover approached the assignment with characteristic seriousness and attention to detail. He understood that modern governance required clear organization, well-defined responsibilities, and systems designed to avoid duplication. The federal government, having grown rapidly during the war years, consisted of numerous agencies with overlapping duties, varied structures, and evolving missions. Hoover believed that careful analysis could help clarify these functions and ensure that the government operated with greater coherence and purpose. The commission assembled a team of experienced individuals drawn from public service, academia, and private industry. Their work unfolded over many months, during which they examined federal departments, reviewed administrative procedures, and studied financial practices. Hoover guided these efforts quietly, encouraging deliberation, evidence-based conclusions, and respect for the complexities of each agency. He avoided politicizing the work, maintaining a focus on practicality rather than ideology. The Commission's recommendations emphasize consolidation where functions overlapped, increased clarity in lines of authority, and improvements to budgeting procedures. Hoover believed deeply in the value of streamlined organization, an approach rooted in both his engineering background and his humanitarian experience. By simplifying structures and reducing inefficiencies, he hoped the government could better serve the public while maintaining responsible use of resources. The resulting report, issued in 1949, represented one of the most comprehensive examinations of federal administration in the nation's history. Congress adopted many of the recommendations over time. Agencies were reorganized, responsibilities were clarified, and procedures were modernized. Though changes unfolded slowly, the Commission's influence endured. Hoover did not seek public acclaim for this work. He regarded it as a continuation of his duty to the country, rather than an extension of his political identity. His measured guidance reflected the traits that had long defined him: discipline, restraint, and an unwavering belief in efficient, orderly administration. A second Hoover Commission was later convened during the 1950s under President Eisenhower. Once again, Hoover was asked to lead the effort, and once again he accepted with a quiet sense of responsibility. The Second Commission examined federal operations in the context of the Cold War, when new agencies and programs had emerged to address national security, scientific research, and international assistance. Hoover applied the same methods he had used previously: careful study, structured inquiry, and a focus on long-term effectiveness. This second round of recommendations also emphasized clarity, coordination, and efficiency. The Commission's proposals supported improved budgeting, or modernization of regulatory processes, and better alignment between agencies with related functions. Hoover hoped that these reforms would help the federal government navigate the demands of a rapidly changing world while preserving stable administrative foundations. Throughout the Commission years, Hoover maintained a steady presence. He traveled regularly to Washington from his home in New York and later California, attending meetings, reviewing drafts, and discussing proposals with colleagues. Though now an elder statesman, he remained intellectually energetic, approaching each task with the same analytical patience that had characterized his early engineering career. His colleagues respected the calm authority he brought to discussions, his ability to consider multiple perspectives, and his dedication to thoroughness. Outside of formal commission work, Hoover spent these years writing and speaking on topics related to government efficiency, international affairs, and historical analysis. His published essays displayed a reflective tone, shaped by decades of experience in both public and private roles. He continued to emphasize the importance of organization, fiscal responsibility, and the cooperative spirit that he believed essential to democratic governance. His writings, though measured, contributed significantly to public understanding of administrative challenges in the mid-20th century. The Commission years represented a culmination of Hoover's lifelong interest in structure and efficiency. From his early engineering assignments to his days in the Commerce Department, through his humanitarian work and presidential administration, he had consistently emphasized clarity, coordination, and steady improvement. The commissions allowed him to apply these values once more, offering guidance that would influence the federal government long after his involvement ended. Though Hoover no longer shaped national policy directly, he continued to contribute through thoughtful analysis and disciplined advice. His work during this period reflected the same quiet dedication that had defined every chapter of his life. The Hoover Commissions became part of his enduring legacy, not for dramatic reforms, but for the steady, organized approach he brought to understanding and improving the nation's governing institutions. In the decades following the Hoover Commission years, Herbert Hoover entered a phase of life defined by steady intellectual activity, selective public engagement, and a deepening commitment to historical reflection. Though well into his later years, he maintained a disciplined routine that allowed him to continue contributing to national conversations while preserving the quiet rhythm that had come to characterize his post-presidential life. The unfolding Cold War, with its shifting alliances and emerging global institutions, provided new subjects for his study and comment, though he approached these matters with the same reflective caution that had guided him throughout earlier periods. Hoover observed the geopolitical landscape with a mixture of experience and restraint. He was attentive to the challenges posed by ideological conflict, the formation of international organizations, and the growing influence of nuclear technology. Yet he chose his public remarks carefully, preferring to analyze developments through the lens of long-term patterns rather than immediate reaction. He wrote articles and essays that examined issues such as foreign aid, governmental expansion, and the responsibilities of democratic societies. His tone remained analytical, free from inflammatory language, and grounded in the belief that clarity and prudence were essential in a rapidly changing world. During these years, Hoover continued to maintain relationships with public officials across party lines. Presidents from both major political parties occasionally sought his perspective on specific issues. Though his role was advisory rather than formal, his long experience made him a valued source of thoughtful insight. He approached these conversations with modesty, or offering carefully reasoned observations rather than sweeping prescriptions. His manner reflected a quiet confidence in the usefulness of disciplined analysis and a respect for the challenges faced by those holding public office. Writing occupied an increasingly central place in Hoover's routine. He devoted substantial time to organizing documents from his long career, preparing materials for future scholars, and composing multi-volume memoirs. These memoirs, written in a calm and reflective style, sought to provide a clear account of the events he had witnessed, the decisions he had made, and the administrative lessons he believed worth preserving. He approached this work with the precision of a trained engineer and the deliberation of a seasoned administrator, arranging facts carefully and avoiding unnecessary embellishment. In addition to memoirs, Hoover authored studies on international relations, economic policy, and humanitarian administration. His writings often revisited the themes that had shaped his earlier life: the value of cooperation, the importance of efficiency in public institutions, and the role of individual responsibility within a democratic society. Although he no longer influenced policy directly, his published works contributed to public understanding of the challenges facing the modern world. Scholars, journalists, and civic leaders frequently consulted his analyses, appreciating their blend of experience and thoughtful restraint. Hoover also participated in conferences and public events, though selectively. He accepted invitations that aligned with his interests in administration, humanitarian work, and historical understanding. At these gatherings, he spoke in a measured tone, emphasizing lessons from history rather than offering political commentary. His presence reflected the respect accorded to elder statesmen whose long careers embodied both service and reflection. Despite the calm, outward rhythm of these years, Hoover remained attentive to humanitarian concerns. He corresponded with organizations engaged in food relief, agricultural development, and refugee assistance, offering guidance grounded in his extensive experience. He believed that even without holding public office, individuals could contribute meaningfully to global well-being through informed counsel and organized service. His involvement in these efforts, though understated, revealed a continuity of character stretching back to his earliest humanitarian work during the First World War. A daily life during this period unfolded with a gentleness that contrasted with the intensity of his earlier years. Hoover divided his time between his residence in New York and his home in California. He enjoyed the quiet presence of family, the company of friends, and the peaceful routine of reading and writing. He often reviewed historical documents, re-examining the choices made during pivotal moments of his life. This reflective process did not seek to refashion the past, but to understand it with greater depth, allowing him to clarify his thoughts for future generations. As age advanced, Hoover continued to work steadily, maintaining the disciplined habits that had shaped him since childhood. He rose early, kept structured hours for study, and approached each day with quiet purpose. Visitors to his home often remarked on his clarity of thought and the calm manner in which he discussed both past events and current issues. Even in later life, he remained committed to the belief that order, analysis, and cooperative effort formed the foundation of responsible public service. Hoover's place in public memory underwent gradual reconsideration during these years. As scholars and observers re-examined the Great Depression and the broader context of his presidency, interpretations became more nuanced. Hoover himself did not seek to influence these debates directly. Instead, he offered documents, reflections, and analyses that could assist others in forming their own assessments. He trusted that historical understanding would emerge through careful study rather than rhetorical persuasion. Through the Cold War period, Hoover lived with a sense of continuity in thought, in routine, and in the values that had guided him across decades. His belief in disciplined organization, personal responsibility, and international humanitarianism remained unchanged. Though no longer at the center of national life, he continued to contribute meaningfully to public understanding and administrative thought. These later years, shaped by steadiness and introspection, formed a bridge between the active responsibilities of earlier decades and the final chapter of his long life. They revealed a man who, despite the weight of past challenges, continued to approach each day with thoughtful purpose, guided by principles he had carried since childhood. In the final phase of his life, Herbert Hoover settled into a steady rhythm marked by routine, reflection, and a quiet engagement with the world around him. Though advanced in age, he retained the disciplined habits that had guided him for decades. His primary residence became the Waldorf Astoria in New York City, where he occupied a suite that provided both privacy and a functional space for continued writing and correspondence. The building's calm, structured environment suited him well. It offered the familiarity of established routines, while placing him at a comfortable distance from the active political centers he had once inhabited. From this residence, Hoover maintained a schedule that balanced work with rest. Mornings were often devoted to reading newspapers, reviewing memoranda, and studying historical texts. Over the years, he had accumulated a vast collection of documents, and he continued to refine his memoirs and other writings. He approached these tasks with the same quiet method he had applied throughout his career, arranging information carefully and checking details with precision. His writing did not seek to persuade in a dramatic manner. Rather, it aimed to present clear accounts of events, guided by the belief that future generations would benefit from orderly documentation. Visitors, including scholars, journalists, and occasional public officials, came to meet with him from time to time. These conversations took place in a setting that reflected his reserved temperament. He listened attentively, responded thoughtfully, and avoided unnecessary elaboration. His remarks often steered toward administrative lessons, international challenges, or reflections on earlier experiences. Those who spoke with him frequently commented on his clarity of thought, and even in advanced age. Hoover remained patient in dialogue, preferring the measured pace of inquiry and response rather than quick or emotional exchanges. Despite the calmness of his routine, Hoover remained connected to public affairs. He followed developments in domestic and international policy with quiet interest, often taking notes or composing private letters in response to events. He did not seek to re-enter political life, nor did he attempt to influence public opinion directly. Instead, he offered observations to those who requested his perspective, maintaining a consistent tone of restraint. His guidance reflected a lifetime of administrative experience, shaped by an understanding that enduring solutions arose from careful study rather than immediate reaction. Hoover also continued to support educational and humanitarian initiatives. He served on boards, contributed to institutional planning, and encouraged the preservation of historical records. One of his lasting achievements during this period was assisting in the development of the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. He envisioned it as a center for the study of war, peace, and governance, drawing upon documents and analyses that could inform future policymakers. Although he no longer traveled extensively, he remained engaged with the institution through correspondence and occasional visits, believing that knowledge grounded in history could guide future generations. With the passing of time, many of Hoover's contemporaries left public life or passed away. This created a certain solitude, though not one marked by melancholy. Hoover seemed to accept the natural quietness of his later years. He filled his days with reading, writing, and reflection, activities that aligned with the orderly calm he had long sought. The view from his residence, overlooking the surrounding city, offered a steady reminder of the changing world outside. Yet Hoover preferred to engage with those changes through thought rather than participation. Health considerations gradually limited the extent of his daily activities, but they did not diminish his interest in the world. He remained mentally active, reading widely on history, economics, and public policy. Even late in life, he undertook significant writing projects, including further volumes of memoirs and analyses of governmental structure. These works continued to reflect his lifelong emphasis on efficiency, cooperation, and the careful organization of public institutions. Personal correspondence also filled a significant portion of his days. He exchanged letters with family members, former colleagues, and friends across the country. These writings revealed both warmth and restraint, shaped by a style that favored clarity and thoughtful reflection. He took care to respond to inquiries from students and researchers, appreciating their interest in historical events and administrative challenges. This engagement added a quiet sense of continuity between his earlier public roles and his later years. As Hoover advanced into his late 80s and early 90s, the pace of his work slowed but did not cease. He maintained the dignity and discipline that had always defined him. His days unfolded gently, marked by the slow turning of pages, the steady movement of pen across paper, and the thoughtful consideration of ideas formed over a lifetime. The calmness of his surroundings matched the tranquility he cultivated within, allowing him to reflect on the arc of his life with quiet clarity. Hoover's later years in New York were not marked by dramatic events or public displays. Instead, they reflected a sustained commitment to order, thoughtfulness, and measured engagement with the world. He devoted himself to understanding the past, supporting institutions he believed in, and offering steady counsel to those who sought his perspective. The gentle rhythm of these years provided a fitting continuation of the values he'd carried since childhood: discipline, modesty, and a deep respect for the power of structured, thoughtful work. In this setting, removed from the urgency of political life yet connected to the unfolding world, Hoover lived out the final chapter before his eventual passing. It was a period defined by quiet purpose, by the steady refinement of ideas, and by the calm presence of a man who'd spent decades navigating both national and global developments with composure. In the autumn of 1964, Herbert Hoover's long life of service, reflection, and steady discipline approached its natural conclusion. At 90 years of age, he had remained active in thought and correspondence, even as his physical strength gradually diminished. His final days were spent in the familiar surroundings of his New York residence, where quiet routines had shaped the rhythm of his later years. There was no dramatic decline, and only a gentle slowing consistent with his advancing age. On October 20th, 1964, Herbert Hoover passed away peacefully, marking the end of a life that had spanned eras of profound change in the United States and the world. News of his death was met with a subdued respect across the nation. Many Americans, especially those who had lived through the early 20th century, remembered him not only as the 31st president, but also as a humanitarian whose efforts during global crises had sustained millions. Newspapers reflected on the wide arc of his life, from his modest beginnings in Iowa to his international work in mining, from his organization of relief during the First World War to his quiet leadership in improving federal administration. Commentators noted the contrasts in his career, the optimism of his early presidency, as the challenges of the Great Depression and the decades of thoughtful public service that followed his time in office. Hoover's body was transported to Washington, D.C., where he lay in state in the Capitol Rotunda. Visitors arrived in a steady, quiet flow. They moved through the hall in prolonged silence, reflecting on a life lived across periods of great national transformation. Some remembered his engineering work and his early humanitarian achievements. Others recalled the difficulties of the Depression years. Many simply wished to pay respects to a figure who had remained active in public thought for more than half a century. The atmosphere inside the rotunda was calm and dignified, reflecting the tone that had characterized Hoover's public presence. A state funeral followed, marked by a gentle solemnity. Though attended by prominent figures in government, academia, and international affairs, the ceremony maintained an understated quality, consistent with Hoover's own temperament. Speakers highlighted his unwavering dedication to organization, efficiency, and service. They noted the steadiness with which he approached both adversity and success, and the unusual breadth of his contributions across engineering, humanitarian work, public administration, and historical study. After the official ceremonies, Hoover was transported to West Branch, Iowa, the small Quaker community where his life had begun 90 years earlier. The journey brought him back to the quiet landscape of his childhood, where the modest rhythms of rural life had shaped his earliest values. He was laid to rest near the simple home that had once sheltered his family. The setting was serene, rolling grass, open sky, and a peaceful environment that reflected the measured, contemplative spirit with which he had lived. In the days and weeks following his burial, reflections on Hoover's legacy appeared across the country. Scholars revisited his presidency with renewed interest, placing it within the broader context of global economic conditions and evolving governmental roles. Historians examined his humanitarian achievements, noting that millions had been fed and supported through his organizational efforts in times of war and reconstruction. Others wrote about his decades of continued service after leaving office, emphasizing the quiet persistence with which he pursued administrative reform and historical understanding. Public memory of Hoover remained complex, and some focused on the challenges of the Great Depression, while others emphasized his administrative rigor, his belief in voluntary cooperation, and his lifelong dedication to relieving suffering where possible. Over time, interpretations grew more balanced, acknowledging both the limitations and the achievements that marked his long career. Through all these assessments, one characteristic consistently emerged: Hoover's deep commitment to disciplined effort, applied steadily and without showmanship, across an extraordinary range of national and international responsibilities. In the calm that followed his passing, the full arc of Hoover's life became easier to observe. From orphaned childhood to global engineer, from humanitarian organizer to president, from post-presidential reformer to elder statesman, his life reflected a quiet persistence that did not waver in the face of shifting circumstances. His death marked the close of a chapter in American history, yet the structures he influenced, the relief systems he designed, the institutions he helped shape, the administrative reforms he inspired, continued to function long after his passing. In the long sweep of 20th century history, Herbert Hoover's life forms a quiet, deliberate arc, beginning in the stillness of a small Iowa town, unfolding across continents through engineering and humanitarian work, rising to the responsibilities of national leadership, and settling at last into reflective years shaped by thought and service. Across each stage he carried with him a steady discipline rooted in early experience, shaped by a belief in order, cooperation, and the quiet power of well-organized effort. His story does not rest on dramatic gestures, but on sustained dedication. He moved through mining camps in distant regions, through relief offices during wartime, through the halls of government during times of uncertainty, always guided by a sense of responsibility that neither hardship nor success could unsettle. Even in the most challenging moments of his presidency, he approached decisions with measured care, believing that stability depended on thoughtful judgment rather than quick or expansive action. Later, in the calm rhythm of his post-presidential years, he continued to write, reflect, and advise, contributing quietly to national life long after leaving public office. Remembering Herbert Hoover requires attention to the quieter dimensions of service, the unseen organization behind humanitarian relief, the patient reworking of administrative structures, the analytical clarity that shaped his view of the world. His legacy rests not only in the public record of his presidency, but also in the enduring institutions and thoughtful writings he left behind. These contributions continue to inform how nations understand governance, cooperation, and the responsibilities of leadership in times of trial. As this narrative draws to a close, the tones soften and the wide span of his life settles gently into memory. The early fields of Iowa, the distant mines of his youth, the committee rooms of wartime relief, the quiet study in his later years all fade into a single continuous line of steady purpose. And in reflecting upon his journey, the movement of history itself seems to slow, offering space for calm appreciation. May this closing moment allow the mind to rest alongside the long, unhurried path of his life, easing gradually toward quiet and stillness,